This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It was around 2 a.m. and I was doing my usual rounds, checking the tracks and equipment. The stations are eerie at night, all empty and echoing, but you get used to it after a while. I was heading down to check one of the storage rooms near the end of the platform. As I got closer, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A little girl's laugh, clear as day, coming from inside the room. Now, you got to understand, there's no way a kid should be down there at that hour. The station's closed, locked up tight, and that storage room, it's kept locked too. Only staff have access. I froze in my tracks, straining my ears. Yep, there it was again, a high-pitched giggle like a young girl playing. It was muffled by the door, but unmistakable. My heart was pounding as I approached the door. Part of me wanted to turn and run, but I had a job to do. What if some kid had somehow gotten trapped in there? With shaking hands, I pulled out my keys and unlocked the door. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly pushed it open, bracing myself for whatever I might find. The door creaked loudly in the silence. I flicked on the lights and peered inside. Nothing. The room was completely empty. I stood there in shock, my eyes darting around. Just the usual shelves of supplies and equipment. No sign of any person, let alone a laughing child. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly checked behind some boxes and in the corners. But the room wasn't big. Nowhere for anyone to hide. I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath was coming in short gasps. What the hell had just happened? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the sound had come from somewhere else and just echoed strangely. But no, I was certain it came from that room. I'd heard it clearly, repeatedly, right up until I opened the door. I finished my rounds in a daze, jumping at every little noise. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I practically ran out of there. The next night, I casually mentioned it to my coworker Miguel as we were starting our shift. I expected him to laugh it off, but his face went pale. "You heard it too?" he whispered. Turns out I wasn't the first. Miguel told me there had been stories for years about strange sounds in that station. Children laughing, running footsteps, even crying, but never any actual kids to be found. He said most of the night staff had experienced something at one point or another. Some refused to work there anymore. Management tried to keep it quiet to avoid panic. I didn't know what to believe. I'm not the superstitious type, you know. But I couldn't explain what I'd heard that night. Over the next few weeks, I was on edge every shift. I avoided that storage room like the plague. But I couldn't avoid the entire station. It was about a month later when it happened again. This time I was on the opposite end of the platform, checking a faulty light fixture. Suddenly I heard the pattering of little feet running behind me. I whirled around, but the platform was empty. The sound faded away, like whoever it was had run around the corner. My heart racing, I ran to check. Nothing, not a soul in sight. But as I stood there, trying to calm myself, I heard a soft whimper, like a child crying. It seemed to be coming from the tracks. Against my better judgment, I leaned over to look. The crying got louder, echoing in the tunnel. It sounded so real, so heartbreaking. For a split second I could have sworn I saw movement in the darkness of the tunnel, a small, pale figure. But when I blinked, it was gone. I scrambled backwards, nearly falling in my haste to get away from the edge. The crying faded away, leaving only the usual hum of the station. I spent the rest of that shift huddled in the staff room, shaken to my core. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the tunnel. A child, a ghost, my imagination running wild. These experiences kept happening, never quite the same, but always terrifying. Sometimes it was laughter echoing through empty corridors. Other times the sound of children playing tag, their footsteps racing around me though I was alone. One particularly bad night, I heard a little girl singing a nursery rhyme. Her voice seemed to follow me as I walked the length of the platform, always just out of sight. I started dreading going to work. I'd break out in a cold sweat as soon as I entered the station. Every shadow, every unexpected noise had me on edge. I thought about quitting, but I needed the job, and part of me felt like I needed to understand what was happening. I tried researching the history of the station, looking for any tragedies involving children that might explain the haunting, but I found nothing conclusive. Some of my co-workers had theories. Miguel thought it might be the ghosts of children who died when the tunnels were first built, though he had no proof of any such deaths. Another guy, Eduardo, insisted it was some kind of time slip, that we were hearing echoes of the past or future somehow bleeding through. Me? I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that it was real, and it was terrifying. The incidents seemed to come in waves. Sometimes weeks would go by without anything unusual. Just when I'd start to relax, thinking maybe it was over, something would happen to set me on edge again. One of the worst nights was about 6 months after my first experience. I was alone in the control room monitoring the security cameras. It was around 3 a.m., the deadest part of the night. I was fighting to stay awake when movement on one of the screens caught my eye. I leaned in for a closer look. There, on the empty platform, was a little girl. She looked to be about 6 or 7, wearing an old-fashioned dress. She was skipping along, her long hair bouncing behind her. I rubbed my eyes, sure I must be seeing things, but when I looked again, she was still there. My hands shaking, I flipped through the other camera feeds. There she was again, now at the end of the platform, then by the ticket machines, then near the stairs. She never looked at the camera, just kept skipping along like she was in her own little world. I watched in horrified fascination as she made her way through the station. Finally, she headed down towards the tracks. Panicked, I grabbed the mic to use the PA system. "Hey, little girl, stop!" I yelled. On the screen, she paused and looked up, seemingly right at the camera. A chill ran through me as I saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes, they were completely black. No whites, no irises, just empty black orbs. She smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that split her face. Then she turned and ran straight for the tracks. I scrambled to hit the emergency stop button, even though no trains were running. On the screen, I saw her reach the edge of the platform. She turned to look at the camera one last time, gave a little wave, and stepped off into thin air. I cried out, but instead of falling, she simply vanished. 1 second she was there, the next, gone. I sat there in shock, my heart pounding. What had I just seen? I rewound the footage, desperate to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. But the video showed nothing, just empty platforms all night long. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screens and trying to make sense of it all. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, my replacement was shaking me awake as my shift ended. I thought about reporting what I'd seen, but who would believe me? I had no proof. And I was scared of being labeled crazy, of losing my job. So I kept it to myself, adding it to the growing list of inexplicable experiences in that station. The incidents continued off and on for years. Some nights were quiet, Others were a nightmare of ghostly sounds and half-glimpsed figures. I never saw that little girl with the black eyes again, thank God. But her face still haunts my dreams sometimes. I worked that job for 10 years before finally transferring to a day shift at a different station. I've never experienced anything like it since. To this day, I don't know how to explain what happened in that station. Was it really haunted? Was there some rational explanation we all missed? Or did we somehow collectively lose our minds down there in the quiet of those long night shifts? All I know is that I'll never forget those nights on Line 3. The laughter in the dark, the phantom footsteps, the ghostly children that were felt but never seen. Sometimes I think about going back, riding the metro late at night to see if I can experience it again. But then I remember that little girl's black eyes and that unnatural smile. And I decide that some mysteries are better left unsolved. The station always felt eerie at night when it was empty, but I was used to it by now. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, and our footsteps echoed off the tiled walls. Mike and I chatted as we made our way through the winding maintenance corridors, our voices providing some comfort in the oppressive silence. We were almost done with our rounds when we reached one of the older tunnels that was no longer in use. It was dimly lit and musty, with pipes and conduits running along the ceiling. As we shone our flashlights down the passageway, I suddenly froze. There, perched on one of the large pipes about 15 feet above us, was a woman. She looked to be in her 30s or 40s, with long, tangled dark hair and tattered, dirty clothes. My first thought was that she must be homeless and had somehow found her way into the tunnels. But how had she gotten up there? And why was she grinning at us like that? "Hey," Mike called out, his voice echoing. "Ma'am, you can't be down here. It's dangerous. We need to get you out." The woman didn't respond. She just kept staring at us with that unsettling smile. Then she started to laugh, a high-pitched, unhinged cackle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at Mike, and I could see he was as freaked out as I was. Let's call this in," he said, reaching for his radio with a shaky hand. But before he could make the call, the woman's laughter suddenly stopped. I looked back up at her, and in that split second she was gone, vanished, there one moment and gone the next, without a sound. "What the hell?" I gasped, my heart pounding. "Did you see that?" Mike nodded, his face pale. Where did she go?" We both stood there for a moment, frozen in shock. Then we snapped into action, searching the tunnel with our flashlights. But there was no sign of the woman anywhere. No footprints, no disturbance in the thick layer of dust on the floor. It was as if she had never been there at all. Thoroughly spooked, we radioed it into the control room. They told us to finish our sweep quickly and get back to the main station. As we hurried through the rest of the tunnels, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound made me jump. When we got back to the control room, our supervisor, Jim, was waiting for us. He looked concerned. "You guys okay? What happened down there?" We recounted our experience, still shaken. Jim listened intently, then shook his head. That's not possible," he said. "We've been monitoring all the security feeds. There's been no sign of anyone in the tunnels all night except you two." "Check the tapes," Mike insisted. "She was there, clear as day." Jim pulled up the footage from the tunnel cameras. We crowded around the monitors, watching intently. But as the video played, there was nothing. Just Mike and me walking through, stopping, looking up at something, then searching around in a panic. The woman was nowhere to be seen. "I don't understand," I said, my mind reeling. "She was right there. We both saw her." Jim looked troubled. "Look, I believe that you saw something, but there's nothing on any of our cameras, and there's no way anyone could have gotten into those tunnels without us knowing about it." We stood there in stunned silence for a moment. Then Jim's radio crackled to life. "Jim, you there?" It was one of the other night shift workers. "We just heard a woman laughing in Tunnel 12. Can you send someone to check it out?" My blood ran cold. Tunnel 12 was on the opposite side of the station from where we had our encounter. Jim responded quickly. "Negative. All personnel stay where you are. We're initiating a full lockdown and sweep of the station." The next few hours were a blur. Police were called in and every inch of the tunnels and station was searched. But they found nothing. No woman. No evidence that anyone had been there who shouldn't have been. As dawn broke and the day shift started to arrive, Mike and I were exhausted and rattled. We gave our statements to the police, but I could tell they didn't really believe us. How could they, when there was no evidence? In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I scoured local news and missing persons reports, hoping to find some clue about who the woman might have been. But there was nothing. Some of our co-workers were sympathetic, but others started to joke about the ghost lady. Management tried to downplay the whole thing, saying it was probably just stress and shadows playing tricks on us. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks there were more reports, whispers of laughter in empty tunnels, glimpses of a dark-haired woman disappearing around corners, but never anything concrete, never anything caught on camera. I still work at the station, but I'm on day shifts now. I requested the change after that night. I just couldn't face those tunnels in the dark anymore. Mike transferred to another station entirely. Sometimes, when I'm locking up at the end of my shift and the station is quiet, I think I hear distant laughter echoing through the tunnels, and I hurry to leave, trying to convince myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know it's not. Whatever we encountered that night, whether it was a ghost, a glitch in reality, or something else entirely, it was real. And it's still down there, in the darkness beneath the city, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never look at those tunnels the same way again. And whenever I hear laughter echoing in an empty space, a chill runs down my spine as I remember the woman on the pipes, grinning down at us before vanishing into thin air. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, I suppose. But I can't help but wonder, what if she's still down there, in the twisting tunnels beneath our feet? What if she's watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to stumble upon her domain? All I can say is this: if you're ever in the metro late at night and you hear laughter echoing through the tunnels, don't look up. Just keep walking and pray that she doesn't notice you, because once you've seen her, you'll never be able to unsee her, and you'll always be looking over your shoulder, wondering when she might appear again. I was running late for my part-time job at the mall that afternoon. My last class had dragged on forever, and I barely made it to the metro station in time to catch the 3:15 train. As I rushed down the stairs to the platform, I could hear the rumble of the approaching train. I breathed a sigh of relief. I had made it just in time. The train was packed as usual for that time of day. I squeezed in between a businessman talking loudly on his phone and a group of giggling middle school girls. As we lurched out of the station, I pulled out my phone to text my boss that I was on my way. The ride to 18 de Marzo station was uneventful. I zoned out, scrolling mindlessly through social media as the train rocked back and forth. Before I knew it, we were pulling into the station where I needed to transfer. I put my phone away and got ready to exit, along with about half the other passengers. As the doors slid open, I shuffled out onto the platform with the crowd. I needed to get to the other side to catch my connecting train, so I made my way towards the stairs leading up to the main concourse. That's when I noticed something strange. The platform suddenly seemed empty. I blinked in confusion, looking around. Where had all the other passengers gone? Just seconds ago, at least 30 or 40 people had gotten off the train with me. Now there wasn't a soul in sight. I felt a chill run down my spine. This didn't make any sense. It was the middle of the afternoon on a weekday. The station should have been bustling with commuters, but the platform was completely deserted except for me. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. My voice echoed off the tiled walls. No response. I walked over to peer down the length of the platform. Nothing but empty benches and trash cans. No sign of the crowd I had just been part of moments ago. My heart started to race. What was going on? Had I imagined all those other people? No, that was impossible. I clearly remembered being squished between other passengers as we exited the train. I pulled out my phone, thinking I should call someone. But who? What would I even say? "Hi." Everyone around me just vanished into thin air. They'd think I was crazy. As I stared at my phone screen, trying to decide what to do, I noticed something else odd. The time read 3:32 p.m., but that couldn't be right. My train had arrived at 3:30, and only a minute or two had passed since then. How had 10 minutes gone by without me noticing? I put my phone away with shaking hands. I needed to get out of here and figure out what was happening. I hurried towards the stairs leading up to the main level of the station. As I approached the staircase, I hesitated. What if whatever bizarre thing that had happened on the platform was happening up there too? What if the whole city had somehow emptied out while I was on the train? I shook my head, trying to calm down. I was being ridiculous. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe there had been some kind of security incident, and everyone had been quickly evacuated while I was distracted. That didn't quite add up, but it was better than believing in mass disappearances. Taking a deep breath, I started up the stairs. I had only climbed a few steps when I heard voices and footsteps above me. Relief washed over me. There were people up there after all. As I emerged onto the main concourse, I was hit by a wall of sound and movement. The station was absolutely packed with commuters rushing in every direction. It was exactly how it should have been at this time of day. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, my mind reeling. How was this possible? The contrast with the empty platform below was jarring. Had I stepped into some kind of parallel universe? I turned around to look back down at the platform. To my shock, it was now filled with people waiting for trains. Dozens of commuters were milling about or sitting on benches, exactly the scene I would have expected to see just minutes ago. My legs felt weak. I stumbled over to lean against a pillar, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I hallucinated the empty platform? Had I briefly lost consciousness, or had some kind of weird blackout? Neither of those explanations felt right. I had been fully aware the entire time, and the experience had felt far too real to be a hallucination. But the alternative, that dozens of people had actually vanished and then reappeared, was too bizarre to contemplate. I pulled out my phone again, wondering if I had imagined the time jump as well. But no. It now read 3:40 p.m. Somehow, 10 minutes really had passed in what felt like only moments to me. I noticed my hands were shaking as I put my phone away. I felt dizzy and slightly nauseous. What the hell had just happened to me? I knew I should continue on to catch my next train and get to work. But I couldn't bring myself to move just yet. I kept replaying the experience in my mind, looking for some detail I had missed that would explain everything. Had there been any signs or announcements I'd failed to notice? Any clues as to where everyone had gone? But no matter how hard I thought about it, I couldn't come up with any rational explanation. I considered going back down to the platform to investigate further. But the thought of returning to the scene of my disturbing experience made my skin crawl. What if it happened again? What if this time I disappeared along with everyone else? I shuddered and decided it was best to just continue on with my day. I was already late for work, and lingering here wasn't going to provide any answers. I'd just have to try to put this out of my mind for now. As I made my way through the crowded station to catch my connecting train, I couldn't shake the feeling that something profoundly strange had occurred. I kept expecting things around me to suddenly change or people to vanish again, but everything remained stubbornly, confusingly normal. I boarded my next train in a daze, barely aware of my surroundings. As we pulled out of the station, I stared out the window at the platform where it had happened. It looked so ordinary now, teeming with commuters. Had I really experienced what I thought I had? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I tried to focus on mundane thoughts about work and what I'd have for dinner later. But my mind kept drifting back to those disconcerting moments of emptiness and silence. The memory of it felt sharp and vivid, refusing to fade like a normal daydream or momentary lapse in attention would. When I finally arrived at my stop, I was still shaken. I texted my boss that I wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be able to come in for my shift. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on work in this state. Instead, I went home and spent hours scouring the internet for any reports of strange occurrences at 18 de Marceau station. But I found nothing out of the ordinary. No service disruptions, no evacuations, nothing that could explain what I'd experienced. I considered posting about it on social media to see if anyone else had witnessed anything similar, but I was afraid of being mocked or dismissed as crazy, and part of me was terrified of finding out I really was the only one who had experienced it. As days and then weeks passed, I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of stress-induced hallucination or vivid daydream. But I could never quite shake the conviction that something truly inexplicable had happened to me that day. I avoided that station as much as possible after that, always feeling a sense of unease when I had to pass through it. I'd find myself scanning the crowds, half expecting people to suddenly vanish again. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of that eerie emptiness out of the corner of my eye, only for it to be gone when I turned to look. To this day, I still don't know what happened in those missing minutes at 18 de Marceau station. Was it a glitch in reality, a momentary slipping between parallel worlds, or just a bizarre trick of my overstressed mind? All I know is that for a few impossible moments, I stood alone on a platform that should have been crowded with people. And no matter how much time passes, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain or forget that unsettling experience. I plopped down next to Jake, giving him a nudge. "Hey man, rough night?" He jolted awake, blinking blearily at me. "Oh, hey Martine. Yeah, these late shifts are killer." We chatted quietly as the train rumbled through the dark tunnels. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows. I found my gaze drawn to the far end of the car. That's when I first noticed her. There was a woman sitting alone in the last row of seats. She was hunched over, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Even from a distance, I could see her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I felt a pang of concern. "Hey, Jake," I whispered. "What do you think is up with that woman back there? Should we check if she's okay?" Jake craned his neck to look. "Oh yeah, I see her. Poor thing looks pretty upset. Might be best to give her some space, though." I nodded, but kept glancing back at the crying woman. There was something unsettling about the way she was curled in on herself, completely still except for the shuddering of her shoulders. As we neared the next stop, I made up my mind to at least offer her a tissue or something. I stood up, steadying myself as the train slowed. "I'm just going to make sure she's all right," I told Jake. He shrugged. "Okay, man, if you think that's best." I made my way down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the quiet car. As I got closer, I could hear faint whimpering sounds. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why I felt so nervous. When I reached the last row, I cleared my throat softly. "Excuse me, miss? Are you okay? Can I help at all?" There was no response. The woman didn't even seem to register my presence. I reached out tentatively to touch her shoulder. "Miss?" My hand passed right through her. I jerked back with a strangled yelp. The woman's form seemed to waver and shimmer, becoming translucent. I could see the seat through her body. "Jake," I called out, my voice shaking. "Jake, are you seeing this?" He looked up from his phone, confused. "Seeing what? What's wrong?" I gestured frantically at the ghost woman. "This, right here. The crying lady, she's not real." Jake stood up and walked over, peering at the empty seat. "Martine, what are you talking about? There's no one there." I whirled around, but the ghostly figure had vanished completely. The end of the car was totally empty. But she was just here," I stammered. "You saw her earlier, right? The woman who was crying?" Jake's brow furrowed with concern. "I didn't see anyone, man. It's just been us this whole time. Are you feeling okay?" I sank onto the bench, my legs suddenly weak. I swear she was here. She looked so real, so sad. I could hear her crying. Jake sat next to me, patting my shoulder awkwardly. "Maybe you're just overtired. These late nights can really mess with your head sometimes." I nodded numbly, but I knew what I'd seen. As we rode the rest of the way in silence, I couldn't shake the image of that poor weeping woman. The depth of sorrow in her hunched posture haunted me. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying the encounter over and over. Had I really seen a ghost? Or was I losing my mind? The next day at work was a blur. I felt disconnected, going through the motions in a daze. That evening, I found myself back at the subway station, boarding the same late-night train. Part of me hoped to see the ghostly woman again, to prove to myself I wasn't crazy, but the car was empty. I sat in the spot where I'd seen her, trying to make sense of it all. As the days passed, I became obsessed with researching the history of that subway line. I scoured old newspaper archives and online forums, looking for any stories of accidents or deaths that might explain the apparition. I found a few vague urban legends about hauntings, but nothing concrete. Still, I kept riding that same train, night after night. Sometimes I thought I caught a glimpse of long dark hair out of the corner of my eye, or heard the faint sound of weeping. But she never appeared again. The experience changed me. I found myself overcome with a persistent melancholy that I couldn't shake. I'd always considered myself a pretty upbeat guy, but now a heavy sadness seemed to follow me everywhere. I started noticing grief and pain all around me that I'd never paid attention to before. the slumped shoulders of the old man feeding pigeons in the park, the red-rimmed eyes of the barista at my local coffee shop, the tremble in my co-worker's voice when she talked about her sick mother. It was like that ghostly encounter had cracked me open, making me hyper-aware of all the sorrow in the world. I wanted to help somehow, to ease people's burdens, but I felt powerless in the face of so much suffering. My friends started to worry about me. "You need to snap out of this funk," Jake told me one night over beers. "Ever since that weird subway thing, you've been different. Maybe you should talk to someone." I tried to explain how I was feeling, but the words fell short. How could I describe the profound sense of loss and longing that had taken root in my soul? It wasn't just about seeing a ghost. It was about glimpsing a realm of pain and sorrow that I could never fully understand or heal. Weeks turned into months. I went through the motions of my life, work, social outings, family dinners, but I felt like I was viewing everything through a veil of sadness. That brief encounter on the subway had fundamentally altered my perception of the world. I kept riding that train, hoping for another glimpse of the crying woman. Not because I wanted proof anymore, but because I longed to comfort her somehow, to let her know she wasn't alone in her grief. But she never reappeared. Still, I felt her presence lingering in that subway car, in the shadows of the tunnels, a reminder of all the invisible pain carried by the strangers we pass every day. One night, almost a year after my ghostly encounter, I boarded the last train home as usual. The car was empty, except for an elderly woman clutching a bouquet of wilted flowers. As the train lurched into motion, I saw her shoulders begin to shake with silent sobs. Without hesitation, I moved to sit beside her. I didn't say anything, just offered a gentle presence. After a few moments, she looked up at me with tear-filled eyes and gave a small, grateful smile. In that moment, I felt a shift. The weight I'd been carrying began to lift. I realized that while I couldn't erase the world's sorrows, I could offer compassion to those around me. Maybe that's why I'd seen the ghost that night, to open my eyes to the pain of others and my own capacity for empathy. As I exited the train that night, I glanced back at the spot where I'd first seen the weeping apparition. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a shimmer of long, dark hair and the outline of a woman. But this time she wasn't hunched in despair. She stood tall, and I could have sworn I saw the ghost of a smile on her face before she faded away into the darkness of the tunnel. I'll never know for certain what I experienced that night on the subway. Was it truly a supernatural encounter, or just a vivid hallucination born of exhaustion? But in the end, I've come to believe that the truth of what I saw matters less than how it changed me. That ghostly woman opened my eyes to the hidden struggles we all carry. She taught me to look beyond the surface, to approach others with kindness and understanding. And while the sadness of that night has never fully left me, I've learned to carry it as a reminder of our shared humanity. Now, when I ride the subway, I look at my fellow passengers with new eyes. Behind every blank face or averted gaze, I imagine the weight of untold stories, and I do my best to offer a smile, a kind word, or simply a compassionate presence, because you never know when a small act of kindness might be the light someone needs in their darkest moment. The ghost in the subway car may be gone, but her impact lingers. She showed me that sometimes the most haunting specters are the ones we carry within ourselves, and in facing them, we open ourselves to a deeper connection with the world around us. As we descended the stairs to the platform, I noticed how the fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting weird shadows on the grimy tile walls. A chill ran down my spine, and I instinctively moved closer to Melissa. She must have sensed my unease, because she gave my arm a reassuring squeeze. "You okay, Vig?" she asked. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. This place gives me the creeps at night." We reached the bottom of the stairs, and I breathed a small sigh of relief to see we weren't completely alone. There was a single figure sitting on one of the benches about halfway down the platform. They were hunched over, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. As we walked past, I couldn't help but glance over. Something about their posture seemed off, too still, almost unnatural. I quickly looked away, not wanting to stare, but then Melissa gasped and grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "V. Gale," she hissed. "Look." I turned back towards the hooded figure, my heart pounding. As if sensing our gaze, they slowly lifted their head, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Where there should have been a human face, there was something else. It was like a twisted hybrid of human and canine features. The elongated snout, the pointed ears, the glassy eyes that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting. But there was still something unmistakably human in its expression, a cold intelligence that made my skin crawl. For a moment that felt like an eternity. We stood frozen in horror, locked in a staring contest with this impossible creature. Then it moved, starting to rise from the bench with unnatural fluidity. That broke the spell, and we both screamed, turning to run back up the stairs. "Help! Someone help us!" Melissa shrieked as we scrambled up the steps, nearly tripping in our panic. I risked a glance over my shoulder and almost lost my footing. The creature was following us, moving with an eerie grace that defied its monstrous appearance. Its movements were silent, save for the soft scraping of claws on tile. We burst out of the stairwell and into the main concourse, gasping for air. There was a security guard standing near the turnstiles, looking bored and half asleep. He snapped to attention at our commotion. "Whoa, what's going on? Are you girls all right?" he asked, his hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon. "There's something down there," I managed to choke out between ragged breaths. "On the platform. It's not human." The guard's expression changed from concern to skepticism. "Not human? What do you mean?" Melissa grabbed his arm. "Please, you have to believe us. It had a dog's face, but it was walking like a person. It was chasing us." He gently removed her hand, looking uncomfortable. "All right, calm down. I'll go check it out. You two stay here." We watched anxiously as he headed down the stairs, his hand on his radio. The minutes crawled by as we huddled together, jumping at every little sound. Finally, the guard reappeared, looking annoyed. "There's nothing down there," he said flatly. "Platform's completely empty." "But—" I started to protest, but he cut me off. "Look, I don't know what you girls think you saw, but there's no one there now. Maybe it was just some homeless guy in a weird mask or something. You shouldn't be out this late anyway. It's not safe." I could tell from his tone that he didn't believe us at all. He probably thought we were drunk or on drugs. Melissa and I exchanged helpless glances, knowing how crazy our story must sound. "Come on," the guard continued, not unkindly. "I'll call you a cab. You should get home and get some sleep." We numbly followed him back to the security office where he phoned for a taxi. As we waited, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing nervously at the stairwell, half expecting to see that horrible dog-like face emerging from the shadows. The ride home was a blur. Melissa and I sat in shocked silence, still processing what we'd seen. We made plans to talk more in the morning, once we'd had a chance to calm down and get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face staring back at me. The next few days were torture. I was jumpy and distracted, unable to focus on anything. My parents noticed my odd behavior and kept asking if I was feeling all right. I made up excuses about exam stress, knowing they'd never believe the truth. Melissa and I compared notes, confirming that we'd both seen the same impossible thing. But we agreed not to tell anyone else. Who would believe us? I couldn't bring myself to take the subway again. Just the thought of going underground filled me with paralyzing dread. I started taking the bus everywhere, even though it added hours to my commute. Melissa was the same way. We both became obsessed with researching urban legends and cryptids, desperate for any explanation of what we'd encountered. A week after the incident, I finally broke down and told my grandfather. He had always been a great listener and had a more open mind about supernatural things. To my immense relief, he didn't dismiss my story or think I was crazy. "I believe you saw something, dear," he said, patting my hand. "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, as Shakespeare said." He shared some stories from his youth about strange encounters in the old country. While none of them quite matched what Melissa and I had seen, it was comforting to know I wasn't alone in experiencing the unexplainable. As the weeks passed, the raw terror of that night faded somewhat, but I never forgot. I still avoid the subway whenever possible, and I'm always on high alert in isolated areas. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of claws clicking on pavement, following me in the darkness. I don't know what that thing in the subway was. Maybe it was some kind of mutant or government experiment gone wrong. Maybe it was a creature from another dimension that found its way into our world. Or maybe it was something that has always been here, hiding in the shadows, only revealing itself to the unlucky few. Whatever it was, the encounter changed me forever. I no longer take for granted that I understand how the world works. There are things out there beyond our comprehension, lurking just out of sight. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, they reveal themselves to us. All we can do is hope we're prepared when they do. I still have nightmares about that face, that horrible fusion of human and canine features. In my dreams, I'm back on that subway platform, paralyzed with fear as the creature slowly approaches. I always wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the echo of inhuman howls ringing in my ears. Melissa and I don't talk about it much anymore. We've both tried to move on with our lives as best we can. But there's an unspoken understanding between us, a shared trauma that will always bind us together. Sometimes I catch her glancing nervously over her shoulder or staring a bit too long at hooded figures on the street. I know she's thinking the same thing I am. What if we see it again? I've become somewhat obsessed with dog-headed mythological figures from various cultures. The Egyptian god Anubis, the Greek cynocephaly, even modern urban legends about dogmen. I scour the internet for similar encounters, hoping to find some validation or explanation for what we experienced. But nothing quite matches up. There are nights when I lie awake, wondering if it's still out there somewhere in the tunnels beneath the city. Does it prey on late-night travelers? Or was our encounter just a fluke, a brief crossing of paths between our world and something else? I don't know which possibility terrifies me more. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But I know deep down that's not true. The raw terror I felt in that moment was too visceral, too real to be imagined. And Melissa saw it too. We couldn't have shared the exact same hallucination. Sometimes I'm tempted to go back to that subway station late at night to see if I can catch another glimpse of the impossible. But then I remember the cold intelligence in those inhuman eyes, the predatory grace of its movements, and my courage fails me. What if it recognized me? What if it decided to follow me home? So I stay away from the underground, sticking to well-lit streets and only traveling during busy daylight hours. I've become hyper-vigilant, always scanning my surroundings for any sign of danger. My friends have noticed the change in me, commenting on how jumpy and paranoid I've become. If only they knew the reason why. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from that night. The encounter shattered my understanding of reality, leaving me adrift in a world where anything seems possible, and not in a good way. Every shadow could be hiding some nightmarish creature. Every stranger on the street could be something inhuman in disguise. But I'm trying to find a way to live with this new awareness. I'm learning to balance caution with the need to keep living my life. I can't let the fear consume me completely. And in some strange way, I'm almost grateful for the experience. It opened my eyes to the vast mysteries of existence, reminding me that there's so much we don't understand about the universe. I just hope that if I ever encounter something like that again, I'll be better prepared. And maybe someday I'll find answers to the questions that have haunted me since that night. Until then, I'll keep watching the shadows, always on guard against the unknown horrors that might be lurking just out of sight. I was on my way home from work, exhausted after a long day at the office. My daughter Emily was with me. I had picked her up from daycare on my way to the subway station. She was only 4 years old at the time, a bubbly little girl with curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As we boarded the train, I noticed it was unusually empty for rush hour. Just a handful of other passengers scattered throughout the car. Emily and I found seats near the middle of the car. She was chattering away about her day at daycare as I absent-mindedly nodded along, my mind still preoccupied with work stress. The train lurched forward and we were on our way home. A few stops later, I realized Emily had gone quiet. I glanced over at her and saw she was staring intently towards the back of the car, a look of concern on her little face. "What's wrong, sweetie?" I asked. She pointed towards the rear of the car. "Mummy, who's that scary lady?" I followed her gaze but saw nothing except empty seats. "What lady, honey? I don't see anyone." Emily's brow furrowed. "The old lady in the black dress. She keeps making scary faces at me." A chill ran down my spine. I scanned the car again, more carefully this time, but there was definitely no one matching that description. Just the same handful of commuters I had noticed earlier, all seated closer to the front. "There's no one there, Em. You must be imagining things," I said, trying to keep my voice light and reassuring. But Emily shook her head emphatically. "No, Mommy, she's right there. Can't you see her? She looks so mean." I was starting to feel genuinely unsettled. Emily had always had an active imagination, but this felt different. The fear in her voice seemed so real. I hugged her close, rubbing her back soothingly. "It's okay, sweetie. There's nothing to be scared of. Let's play a game to take your mind off it, okay?" But Emily remained tense, her eyes fixed on that empty spot at the back of the car. As I tried to distract her with silly questions and tickles, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had come over me. The train slowed as we approached the next station. I glanced out the window expecting to see the familiar platform, but instead saw only darkness. We came to a stop, but the doors didn't open. There was no announcement, no other passengers getting on or off, just silent darkness outside the windows. Mommy, Emily's voice quavered. The scary lady is coming closer. My heart was pounding now. I pulled Emily onto my lap and held her tight, my eyes darting around the car. Still no sign of this mysterious figure, but the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. "Don't look at her, baby," I whispered. "Just close your eyes. Everything's going to be fine." But I didn't believe my own words. Something was very wrong. The other passengers seemed oblivious, reading their phones or dozing. How long had we been stopped here? Why weren't the doors opening? Emily buried her face in my chest, trembling. "She's right next to us now, Mommy," she whimpered. "I don't like her face. Make her go away." I was on the verge of panic. I wanted to run, to grab Emily and bolt for the doors, but some instinct told me that would only make things worse. So I sat frozen, my arms wrapped protectively around my daughter, silently willing the train to start moving again. After what felt like an eternity, there was a crackle of static, and the conductor's voice came over the speakers. "We apologize for the delay, folks. We'll be moving again momentarily." I let out a shaky breath as the train slowly began to roll forward. Light flooded back in through the windows as we emerged from whatever strange pocket of darkness we had been trapped in. Is she gone?" I asked Emily hesitantly. She peeked out from where she had been hiding against me, her eyes wide and watery. She nodded. "She disappeared when the train started moving. But, Mommy, I'm scared she'll come back." I smoothed her hair, trying to calm my own racing heart. "It's okay, baby. She's gone now. We'll be home soon." The rest of the ride passed in a blur. I held Emily close, jumping at every little noise and movement. When we finally reached our stop, I practically ran off the train, not relaxing until we were above ground in the fading evening light. That night, after tucking Emily into bed, I poured myself a large glass of wine and tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all just been a child's overactive imagination? A shared hallucination brought on by fatigue and the strange darkness of that mystery station? I wanted so badly to believe there was a rational explanation, but deep down, I knew we had experienced something beyond the realm of the ordinary. I hoped that would be the end of it, a bizarre, frightening anomaly that we could put behind us. But a few years later, when Emily was 7, we were walking past an old church in our neighborhood when she suddenly froze, her face draining of color. "Mommy," she whispered, clutching my hand. "That's her, the scary lady from the train." I followed her gaze and saw an elderly nun emerging from the church, her face partially obscured by her habit. My blood ran cold as Emily described how similar she looked to the terrifying apparition from that day on the subway. The sunken cheeks, the deep-set eyes, the stern expression. We hurried past, and I tried to convince Emily and myself that it was just a coincidence, just an ordinary nun who happened to resemble the figure from her childhood imagination. But the fear in her eyes told me she wasn't buying it any more than I was. To this day, Emily refuses to ride the subway. She's in high school now, but that experience left an indelible mark on her. Sometimes I catch her eyeing elderly women in black clothing warily, as if searching for a glimpse of that haunting face from her childhood. As for me, I still take the train to work each day. But I'm always on edge, especially when we pass through dark tunnels between stations. I find myself scanning the car, half expecting to see a sinister figure materialize in an empty seat. And on the rare occasions when the train stops unexpectedly in a stretch of darkness, I can't help but remember that terrifying day and wonder, what if it happens again? What if next time I'm the one who sees her? I've tried researching similar experiences, looking for any explanation of what we encountered. I've found a few vague urban legends about ghost trains and phantom passengers, but nothing that quite matches our experience. Part of me still wants to believe it was all just an illusion, a trick of the light and an impressionable child's fear. But deep down, I know what we experienced was real. Sometimes I lie awake at night, replaying that day in my mind. The crushing darkness outside the windows, the oppressive silence in that phantom station, and always the thing that chills me most, the fact that I never saw the figure that terrified my daughter so completely. What would I have seen if I had been able to perceive it? What was it about that entity that was so horrifying to a child's eyes? I don't have answers. I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that can reach out and touch our lives in ways we can never fully comprehend or explain. And sometimes those brushes with the unknown leave scars that never fully heal. So if you're riding the subway late one night and the train stops in a patch of inexplicable darkness, keep your eyes forward. Don't look to the back of the car, and if you feel an overwhelming sense of dread, a prickling on the back of your neck like you're being watched, just close your eyes and wait for the train to start moving again, because you never know what might be lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. I was so excited for our Valentine's Day trip to Guadalajara. My boyfriend Alex and I had been planning it for months, a romantic getaway to explore the beautiful colonial architecture, try authentic Mexican cuisine, and just spend quality time together away from our busy lives back home. We arrived at our cute Airbnb apartment in the historic center and spent the first day wandering the charming streets hand in hand, stopping to admire colorful buildings and nibble on street tacos. Everything was perfect until that evening when we returned to our apartment to freshen up before dinner. I went to unpack my suitcase and noticed a strange, sickly, sweet odor as soon as I unzipped it. Confused, I started removing my neatly folded clothes, trying to find the source of the smell. As I dug deeper, my fingers brushed against something damp and sticky. My stomach dropped as I pulled out a handful of my clothes, now stained with an oily black liquid. "Alex, come here. Something's wrong with my suitcase," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. He came over and peered inside, his face scrunching up at the smell. "What the hell?" he muttered. Together we emptied the contents of the suitcase onto the bed. Most of my clothes were ruined, soaked through with the foul-smelling black liquid. But nothing could have prepared me for what we found at the bottom of the bag. Nestled in a bed of wilted, blackened leaves and flowers was the mutilated corpse of a large bird. I think it may have been a crow or raven. Its feathers were matted with the same oily substance, and its flesh seemed to be partially decomposed. But the most disturbing part was its eyes, or rather, where its eyes should have been. Instead of normal bird eyes, two small, intricately carved stone amulets had been inserted into the empty sockets. I recoiled in horror, nearly vomiting from the sight and smell. Alex quickly wrapped the bird's body in a towel and took it to the bathroom to examine more closely. I sat on the edge of the bed, shaking uncontrollably, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. "Babe, you need to see this," Alex called from the bathroom. On wobbly legs, I made my way over. He had partially unwrapped the bird's body and was pointing to something on its chest. Carved into the decomposing flesh were several strange symbols I didn't recognize. What does this mean?" I whispered, unable to look away from the grotesque sight. Alex shook his head, looking as bewildered and disturbed as I felt. "I have no idea, but this isn't some random dead bird. Someone deliberately put this in your suitcase. The symbols, the eye amulets. It almost looks like some kind of ritual." A chill ran down my spine at his words. Who would do something like this, and why? My mind was racing, trying to piece together how this could have happened. We'd only been in Guadalajara for a day, and my suitcase had been with me the entire time since we left home. "We need to call the police," I said, finally tearing my eyes away from the horrific scene. Alex nodded in agreement and went to get his phone. But as he dialed, another thought struck me. I grabbed my own phone with trembling hands and called my mom. I knew she was probably sleeping back home, but I needed to hear her voice. To my relief, she answered on the third ring. "Honey, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. I tried to keep my voice steady as I recounted what we'd found, but I could hear the panic creeping in. My mom listened quietly, only interrupting occasionally to ask for clarification. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "I'm calling Maria right now. Don't touch anything else until I call you back." Maria was my mom's best friend, an older Mexican woman who had moved to our town years ago. She was deeply spiritual and knowledgeable about various folk traditions and beliefs. If anyone could shed light on what was happening, it would be her. The next 30 minutes were agonizing. Alex had gotten through to the local police, who said they would send someone to investigate. We sat in tense silence, both lost in our own thoughts and fears. When my phone finally rang, I answered it before the first ring had even finished. "Mom? I'm here with Maria," she said. "I'm putting you on speaker." Maria's accented voice came through clearly. "Mija, listen to me carefully. What you have found is very dangerous. It is a work of black magic meant to bring great harm." My blood ran cold at her words. "What do you mean? Who would do this?" "The bird, the plants, the symbols, these are all part of a powerful curse," Maria explained. "The fact that it was in your suitcase means it was aimed at you specifically. Someone wants to cause you pain, possibly even death." I felt like I couldn't breathe. Alex must have noticed because he wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close. Maria continued, "But there is good news. The ritual was not completed. If it had been, you would already be feeling the effects. Something must have interrupted whoever was performing it." "So, what do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do not touch anything else in the suitcase," Maria instructed firmly. "When the police arrive, tell them everything, but do not let them remove the bird or any of the other items. Once they are finished, you must perform a cleansing ritual to protect yourself." She gave us detailed instructions on how to safely dispose of everything and perform the necessary rituals to ward off any lingering negative energy. By the time we hung up, I felt slightly calmer, but still deeply shaken. The police arrived shortly after. They were clearly skeptical at first, but their demeanor changed as soon as they saw the contents of the suitcase. They took numerous photos and samples, asked us endless questions, and finally sealed everything in evidence bags. Following Maria's instructions, we convinced them to leave the bird and other ritual items with us. As soon as they left, we performed the cleansing ritual exactly as she had described. We burned sage and copal, sprinkled holy water, and recited prayers in both English and Spanish. Finally, We took the sealed bags containing the bird and other items to a crossroads outside of town. We buried everything deep in the earth, marking the spot with a cross made of 2 sticks tied together with red string, just as Maria had instructed. It was nearly dawn by the time we returned to our Airbnb. We were exhausted, emotionally drained, and still terrified. Neither of us slept that day, jumping at every little sound and constantly checking to make sure we were safe. We cut our trip short and flew home the next day. I couldn't bear to stay in Guadalajara a moment longer than necessary. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about what we found. I've become paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder and wondering who could have wished me such harm. The police investigation went nowhere. They found no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, nothing to indicate who might have placed the cursed items in my suitcase. It's as if they appeared out of thin air. I've spent countless hours researching similar cases, trying to understand what happened to me. I've learned that such practices are not unheard of in certain parts of Mexico, but they're usually performed by skilled practitioners of black magic. The idea that someone targeted me specifically with such a powerful and malevolent ritual still keeps me up at night. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The experience has changed me profoundly. I find myself drawn to protective talismans and rituals, desperately seeking any way to guard against unseen threats. Sometimes I wonder if whoever tried to curse me will try again. Other times, I convince myself it was all just a horrible mistake or misunderstanding. But deep down, I know the truth. Someone out there wanted to hurt me in the worst way possible. And the scariest part is, I may never know who or why. If you're traveling to unfamiliar places, especially those with rich spiritual traditions, please be careful. Watch your belongings closely. And if you ever encounter anything strange or unexplainable, don't hesitate to seek help from those who understand such matters. It might just save your life. We had been dating for about 6 months at that point, and things were going great. Lucia was smart, funny, and had this infectious laugh that could light up a room. That day, we decided to take advantage of the beautiful weather and have a picnic in the park. It was a perfect Argentine summer day. Bright blue skies, a gentle breeze, and temperatures in the mid-70s. As we spread out our blanket under a shady tree, I noticed Lucia seemed a bit on edge. When I asked her what was wrong, she hesitated before admitting that the park brought back some difficult memories of her grandfather, who had passed away 5 years ago. Apparently, he used to take her and her sisters there when they were little. He wasn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type, Lucia explained, picking at the grass. More like a drill sergeant. He'd make us run laps around the park and time us with a stopwatch. If we didn't beat our previous time, no ice cream. I was taken aback. The way she described him sounded more like a coach than a grandfather. But I could tell there was more to the story that she wasn't sharing yet. I gave her hand a gentle squeeze, letting her know she could open up if she wanted to. After a deep breath, Lucia continued. The thing is, my grandfather was complicated. He had a temper and he could be really controlling. Sometimes he'd threaten us, saying if we didn't behave, he'd come back to haunt us even after he was gone. She let out a humorless laugh. Kid stuff, you know, but it scared us at the time. I nodded, not quite sure how to respond. It was clear this was a heavy topic for her, and I didn't want to push too hard. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just taking in the scenery and the sounds of children playing nearby. That's when things started to get weird. I was about to suggest we start unpacking our picnic when I noticed Lucia had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. Following her gaze, I saw an elderly man on a bicycle, pedaling slowly along the path that circled the park. There was nothing particularly unusual about him at first glance, just a guy out for a ride on a nice day. But as I looked closer, I realized something was off. The man's clothes seemed dated, like something out of an old photograph, and there was a strange shimmer around him, almost like heat waves rising from hot pavement. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked back, the man was staring directly at us. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I could see right through him to the trees behind. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some old guy on a bike. This was something else entirely. I turned to Lucia, my mouth dry. Do you see him too?" I managed to croak out. She nodded slowly, her face pale. "It's him," she whispered. "It's my grandfather." My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Ghosts weren't real. And yet, there he was, clear as day, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The ghostly figure began to pedal towards us, and I felt Lucia's grip on my hand tighten painfully. As he got closer, I could make out more details. A stern face with bushy eyebrows, a neatly trimmed mustache, and eyes that seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. He came to a stop about 10 feet away from our blanket, and for a moment everything was silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. The air felt thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. Then, to my horror, he spoke. "Lucia," the apparition said, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I told you I'd be watching." Lucia let out a strangled sob beside me, and I instinctively moved to put myself between her and the ghost. But what could I do against something that wasn't even solid? "You can't hurt her," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You're not real. You're just a memory." The ghost's eyes snapped to me, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "Real enough, boy," he growled. "Real enough to keep my promise." With that, he began to pedal again, circling our blanket slowly. Round and round he went, never taking his eyes off us. I felt trapped, like a mouse being stalked by a cat. Lucia was shaking uncontrollably beside me, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how long we sat there, paralyzed with fear, as the ghost of Lucia's grandfather circled us. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that moment. Finally, mercifully, the apparition began to fade. With one last piercing look at Lucia, he vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the faintest smell of tobacco and leather. As soon as he was gone, the spell seemed to break. The sounds of the park came rushing back, children laughing, dogs barking, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But for us, everything had changed. We packed up our picnic in silence, neither of us having much of an appetite anymore. As we walked out of the park, Lucia finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I should have told you everything about him before. I didn't think it was real. I thought it was just nightmares and old fears." I put my arm around her, pulling her close. "It's okay," I said, even though nothing felt okay at that moment. "We'll figure this out together." And we have been in the months since that day. We've researched family history, talked to psychics, even had the park blessed by a priest. But nothing has fully explained what we saw that day in Juan Joufre Park. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the burning eyes of Lucia's grandfather as he circled us on that ghostly bicycle. And I wonder, was it really just a shared hallucination? Or is there more to this world than we can explain? One thing's for sure, I'll never look at a bicycle the same way again. And whenever we pass Juan Joufre Park, we walk a little faster, holding hands just a little tighter. Because now we know some promises reach beyond the grave, and some spirits refuse to rest in peace. I was just a kid when it happened, but the memory of that day in the Sierra de la Sepultura still haunts me. It was the summer of 1980, and my mom had dragged me along on one of her work trips with Conafe. I was used to tagging along on these rural education missions, but something about this particular village felt different from the moment we arrived. The air was thick and heavy as we made our way up the winding mountain road. The dense forest seemed to close in around us, blocking out most of the sunlight. I remember feeling a sense of unease, like we were entering somewhere we didn't belong. When we finally reached the small indigenous community, it was eerily quiet. No children playing or villagers going about their day. Just silence broken only by the occasional bleat of a sheep. My mom and the other Conafe workers started unloading supplies and setting up for their educational programs. But I hung back, taking in our surroundings. That's when I first noticed them, a small group of children at the edge of the village, huddled around something I couldn't quite make out. Curious, I wandered closer, thinking maybe they had found an interesting bug or plant to examine. But as I approached, I realized they were gathered around a few sheep, or borregos as they're called in Mexico. At first I thought nothing of it. Sheep were common in these rural mountain communities. But then I heard it. Voices. Not the high-pitched voices of the children, but deep, guttural sounds that seemed to be coming from the sheep themselves. I froze in my tracks, certain I must be imagining things. But as I listened more closely, I could clearly hear words being formed, though in a language I didn't understand. The sheep's mouths were moving in unison with the sounds. And strangest of all, the children appeared to be responding, nodding and gesturing as if in conversation. My heart started racing, and I backed away slowly, not wanting to draw attention to myself. I ran back to where my mom was organizing school supplies and tugged urgently on her sleeve. "Mama, Mama, you have to come see," I whispered frantically. She tried to brush me off at first, busy with her work, but she must have sensed my distress because she finally put down the box she was carrying and followed me towards the edge of the village. As we got closer, I pointed to where I had seen the children, but they were gone now, along with the sheep. My mom looked at me quizzically. "What am I supposed to be seeing, mija?" she asked. I stammered out an explanation of what I'd witnessed. The talking sheep, the strange language, the children responding. I could tell from her expression that she didn't believe me. She probably thought I was making up stories again to entertain myself. But then her face changed. She cocked her head to the side, listening intently. And I heard it again too. Those same deep, rumbling voices speaking words I couldn't comprehend. Only this time, there were no sheep or children in sight. The sounds seemed to be coming from the forest itself. My mom's face went pale. She grabbed my hand and quickly led me back to the Conafe team, speaking in hushed tones to her colleagues. I caught snippets about strange voices and unexplained phenomena. The mood among the adults shifted palpably. What had started as a routine education mission now felt tense and ominous. As dusk fell, an oppressive fog rolled in from the mountains. The villagers seemed to vanish into their homes, leaving us alone in the misty darkness. No one spoke above a whisper. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. I huddled close to my mom as she and the team hurriedly packed up their supplies. The original plan had been to stay in the village for several days, but it was clear we would be leaving immediately. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it. We weren't welcome here. Something wanted us gone. As we loaded into the vehicles, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A group of sheep emerged from the mist, their eyes seeming to glow in the darkness. And though no one else appeared to be around, I swear I heard those rumbling voices again, speaking words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with dread. The drive back down the mountain was a blur of fear and confusion. My mom held me close, occasionally exchanging worried glances with her colleagues. No one spoke. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under the tires and the pounding of my own heart. When we finally reached the main road, I heard several sighs of relief. But I knew we weren't safe yet. Whatever we had encountered up there in those remote mountains had shaken us all to our core. The next day, my mom received a call from her Conife supervisors. They were under strict orders never to return to that village. The entire area was now off limits. No explanation was given, but none was needed. We all knew that something profoundly unnatural resided in those misty mountains. In the years since, I've tried to make sense of what happened that day. I've researched obscure folklore about talking animals and indigenous legends of spirits that take animal form. I've even reached out to linguistic experts to try and identify the strange language I heard. But I've found no satisfying explanations. Sometimes I wonder if it was all just an elaborate hallucination brought on by the high altitude and my overactive childhood imagination. But then I remember the fear in my mother's eyes, the hushed conversations among the Conife team, the official order never to return. Whatever we encountered that day in the Sierra de la Sepultura was real, and it's a mystery that continues to haunt me to this day. I still have nightmares sometimes. I'm back in that village, surrounded by fog. Those deep voices echo all around me, but I can't understand the words. Sheep emerge from the mist, their eyes glowing, their mouths moving in impossible ways. And I know with a bone-deep certainty that they're trying to tell me something important, something terrifying. But I always wake up before I can decipher their message. And maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. All I know for certain is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Forces that lurk in the shadows of remote mountains and misty forests. And sometimes, if we're not careful, we might stumble upon them. But we may not like what we find, so if you ever find yourself in the Sierra de la Sepultura, be wary. Listen closely to the sounds of the forest, and if you hear deep voices speaking in an unknown tongue, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. For you may have encountered the talking sheep of Chiapas, and trust me, you don't want to hear what they have to say. The days were filled with playing in the dusty streets, chasing each other through the fields, and helping our aunt tend to her small vegetable garden. But as the sun went down each evening, a strange uneasiness would settle over the town. The adults would hurry to finish their errands and return home before dark, locking their doors tightly behind them. We didn't understand why at the time, but looking back, I think they all sensed something wasn't right. One night, after we'd finished dinner, my cousins and I were sitting on the front porch, trying to catch a cool breeze in the stifling summer heat. The street was deserted and eerily quiet. The only sound was the buzzing of insects and the occasional barking of a distant dog. Suddenly, Maria grabbed my arm and pointed down the street. "Look!" she whispered urgently. At first, I didn't see anything in the dim light cast by the single street lamp, but then I saw her. A woman was walking slowly down the middle of the road, her bare feet making no sound on the packed dirt. She was wearing a long white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, but as she drew closer, I realized with growing horror that something was terribly wrong. Her face was wrong, distorted and misshapen, like a wax figure that had begun to melt. Her skin was pale and waxy, with dark hollows where her eyes should have been. And her hair, God, her hair, it was thin and patchy, barely covering her scalp in wispy strands. I wanted to run inside, to hide under my bed and forget what I was seeing, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away as the woman's unnatural gait brought her closer and closer to where we sat. Carlos, always the bravest of us, stood up suddenly. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice shaking slightly. "Are you lost?" The woman's head snapped towards us at an impossible angle, and I swear I heard the cracking of bones. A low, rattling moan escaped her lips, and I felt the blood drain from my face. This was no living woman. Maria started to scream, and that finally broke the spell. We scrambled to our feet and ran inside, slamming the door behind us. Our aunt and uncle came running, alarmed by the commotion. Through our terrified sobs, we tried to explain what we'd seen. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought we were just telling stories, letting our imaginations run wild in the dark. But when they saw how genuinely frightened we were, the color drained from their faces. My uncle went to the window and peered out cautiously, his hand shaking as he pulled back the curtain. I'll never forget the look on his face when he turned back to us. "Stay away from the windows," he said hoarsely, "and don't go outside no matter what you hear." We huddled together in the living room that night, too terrified to sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, made us jump. I kept expecting to see that horrible face pressing against the window, those empty eye sockets staring in at us. The next morning, my aunt and uncle had a hushed conversation in the kitchen. We caught snatches of it. "Can't stay here. Not safe for the children. Have to leave." By that afternoon, they had made the decision. We were moving immediately. As we packed our belongings in a frantic rush, neighbors came by to see what was happening. When my uncle explained, in a low voice, what we had seen, their reactions were strange. Some looked frightened, crossing themselves and muttering prayers. Others just nodded grimly, as if they had been expecting something like this to happen. One old woman, her face lined with worry, pulled my aunt aside. I strained to hear what she was saying. "It's her, isn't it?" the old woman whispered. "Poor Mariana. She never did rest easy." It wasn't until years later that I learned the full story. Mariana had been a neighbor, living just a few houses down from my aunt and uncle. She had died 3 months before that terrible night, after a long and painful illness that had left her wasted and disfigured. The description of her in her final days matched exactly what we had seen walking down that street. We left Miguel de la Madrid that very day, piling into my uncle's old truck with whatever we could carry. As we drove away, I looked back at the town receding in the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure in white standing in the middle of the road watching us go, but I blinked, and it was gone. I've never been back to Miguel de la Madrid. My aunt and uncle sold the house as soon as they could, eager to put that chapter of their lives behind them. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that small town and the horrors it held. I've tried to rationalize what we saw that night. Maybe it was just a sick woman, confused and wandering the streets. Maybe it was a collective hallucination brought on by the oppressive heat and the eerie atmosphere of the town. But deep down, I know the truth. What we saw that night was something that shouldn't exist in our world, a glimpse beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead. I'm an adult now, with a family of my own, but I still sleep with a light on, and I never, ever look out the window after dark. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm always afraid I'll see her again, the ghost woman of Miguel de la Madrid, with her distorted face and wispy hair, coming to claim me at last. I know this story sounds unbelievable. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I swear on everything I hold dear that every word is true. And if you ever find yourself in a small town in Mexico where the nights are too quiet and the shadows seem to move on their own, remember my story. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the figures walking in the dark. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The first few weeks were a flurry of activity as we started renovations. One of the first projects was to get the old Noria, or water well, on the property working again. It was a beautiful stone structure, clearly very old, with an iron bucket system to draw water. I spent a full Saturday clearing away overgrown plants and debris, oiling the mechanism, and getting it functional again. That night, exhausted from a long day's work, I fell into a deep sleep. Around 3 a.m. I was jolted awake by the sound of creaking metal coming from outside. Still groggy, I stumbled to the window and peered out into the moonlit yard. What I saw made my blood run cold. The Noria's crank was turning slowly, all on its own. The bucket was rising from the depths, but instead of water, it was overflowing with what looked like old clothing. I blinked hard. Sure, I must be dreaming. But when I looked again, the scene remained. Throwing on a robe, I raced outside to investigate. By the time I reached the well, the bucket had lowered again. I cranked it back up myself, heart pounding, but found it empty. Had I imagined the whole thing? The next morning over coffee, I hesitantly mentioned what I'd seen to my wife Maria. To my surprise, she didn't dismiss it outright. "I had the strangest dream last night," she said. "I saw a woman in an old-fashioned dress standing by the well. She seemed to be trying to tell me something, but I couldn't make out the words." We tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to stress and an overactive imagination. But deep down, an uneasy feeling had taken root. A few nights later, I awoke to find Maria's side of the bed empty. Concerned, I went looking for her and found her standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the Noria. "Do you see them?" she whispered. I looked, but saw nothing in the darkness. Maria described seeing multiple figures moving around the well, all dressed in clothing from different time periods. When I flipped on the porch light, the yard was empty. These incidents continued over the next few weeks. We'd wake to find the Noria's bucket filled with items that had no business being there. Children's toys from the 1950s, letters written in faded ink, even pieces of what looked like Aztec jewelry. Each time, we'd remove the items, only for new ones to appear the next night. The most terrifying night came about a month after we'd moved in. We were startled awake by a loud, rhythmic knocking. It wasn't coming from the front door, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Maria clung to me, trembling, as we listened to the eerie sound moving through the house. Summoning all my courage, I got up to investigate. As I entered the hallway, I saw them, 3 translucent figures gliding silently towards me. One was a man in what looked like a Spanish conquistador's armor. Another was an indigenous woman in traditional dress. The third was a young boy in 1940s-style clothing. They didn't speak, but made urgent gestures towards the back of the house, towards the Noria. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. After what felt like an eternity, they simply faded away. When I finally regained my senses, I ran back to Maria. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, lights blazing, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The next day, we called in a local priest to bless the property. He seemed skeptical of our story, but performed the ritual anyway. For a few days, things were quiet. We dared to hope it was over. But then one morning, we woke to find the entire yard flooded. The Noria had overflowed during the night, spilling water everywhere. And floating in that water were dozens of personal objects, photographs, letters, pieces of clothing, all from different eras of history. As we waded through the mess, collecting the waterlogged items, a chill ran down my spine. These weren't just random objects. They were pieces of people's lives, their memories, their stories. Somehow, this well was connected to the past in ways I couldn't begin to understand. We considered selling the property and moving, but something held us back. It felt like we had stumbled upon a mystery that needed solving. We started researching the history of the land, reaching out to previous owners, even consulting with paranormal experts. What we uncovered was fascinating and disturbing. The property had once been part of an ancient indigenous settlement, then a Spanish colonial outpost, and later a stop on a trade route. The Noria had been there through it all, witness to centuries of human joy and suffering. Some locals believed the well was a portal of sorts, a thin place where the veil between worlds was weaker. Others thought it might be cursed or perhaps blessed, depending on who you asked. We never did get a full explanation for what we experienced. The appearances of ghostly figures became less frequent over time, but the Noria continued its strange behavior. We'd still occasionally wake to find it full of out-of-place items, or hear whispers and music drifting up from its depths in the dark of night. After months of sleepless nights and constant anxiety, we made a difficult decision. We hired a crew to seal the Noria with concrete, closing it off permanently. It felt wrong somehow, like we were locking away a piece of history. But we couldn't live with the uncertainty and fear any longer. The paranormal activity stopped after that, but I often find myself standing at the kitchen window, staring at that sealed well. I can't help but wonder about the stories it holds, the lives it has touched across the centuries. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear faint whispers carried on the breeze. Secrets of the past that will remain forever buried in that mysterious Noria. We still live in that house today, nearly 30 years later. We've made it our home, filled it with love and new memories, but I'll never forget those first terrifying months and the glimpse we got into a world beyond our understanding. The Noria may be sealed, but the mystery remains. A constant reminder that there are some things in this world that defy explanation. I was working as a construction manager in Puerto Lopez, overseeing a new beachfront hotel project. It was grueling work under the hot Ecuadorian sun, but the pay was good, and I enjoyed the challenge. Little did I know that this job would lead to an encounter that would haunt me for years to come. It was about 2 weeks into the project when I first noticed him. A young guy, maybe in his early 20s, working alongside the rest of the crew. He was lean but strong-looking, with messy dark hair and tanned skin. Nothing too out of the ordinary, except I didn't remember hiring him. I approached him, figuring he must be new. "Hey there," I called out. "I don't think we've met. I'm Matthias, the site manager." He looked up from the trench he was digging and gave me a faint smile. "Nice to meet you, sir," he replied politely. His voice was soft, almost whispery. I waited for him to offer his name, but he just went back to shoveling. A bit odd, but I figured he was just shy. "So when did you start working here?" I asked. He paused again, leaning on his shovel. "Oh, I've been here a long time," he said cryptically. Then he added, "It's important work we're doing, building something that will last. For our children, you know?" I nodded, though I was starting to feel a bit unsettled. Something about his manner was just off. Before I could ask anything else, one of the foremen called me over to look at some blueprints. When I glanced back, the young man had disappeared. Over the next few days, I kept an eye out for him. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him working in the distance, but whenever I tried to approach, he seemed to vanish. I asked around, but none of the other workers seemed to know who I was talking about. I started to wonder if the heat was getting to me. Then, about a week later, I saw him again. This time he was helping to lay foundation near the edge of the property. I hurried over, determined to get some answers. "Hey, hold up a second," I called out as I got closer. He straightened up slowly, turning to face me. Up close, I noticed his eyes were an unusual pale green color. "Look, I need to know who hired you," I said firmly. "We can't have unauthorized people on the site. It's a liability issue." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "I told you, I've been here a long time," he said in that same soft voice. "Longer than you know." Then he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We all have our reasons for being here, don't we? Our purpose?" A chill ran down my spine despite the midday heat. Before I could respond, there was a shout from behind me. "Boss, we found something weird over here!" I turned to see one of the excavator operators waving me over urgently. When I looked back, the strange young man was gone again. Shaken, I made my way over to where a small crowd of workers had gathered around a deep hole in the ground. As I got closer, I could see they had unearthed what looked like an old wooden box. My stomach dropped as I realized it was a coffin. "What the hell?" I muttered, peering down into the hole. The wood was rotted and falling apart, but it was unmistakably a simple wooden casket. "How old do you think this is?" One of the older workers shook his head. "No idea, boss, but look at this." He held up a small, tarnished metal object. As he wiped away some of the dirt, I realized it was an old picture frame. My blood ran cold as the image became clear. It was a faded sepia photograph of a young man, the same one I'd been seeing around the site. The same messy, dark hair, the same unusual pale eyes. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, but it was undoubtedly him. "Oh my God," I whispered. That's him, the guy I've been seeing around here. But how—" The workers exchanged confused glances. "What guy, boss?" one of them asked. "We haven't seen anyone new on site." I stared at them in disbelief. "The young guy. Dark hair, green eyes. He's been here for days, working alongside us. How can you not have seen him?" They just shook their heads, looking increasingly concerned. I could feel panic rising in my chest. "Look, he was just over there a few minutes ago." I pointed towards where I'd last seen him, but of course there was no one there now. "Boss, maybe you should take a break," one of the guys suggested gently. "It's been real hot lately. Easy to get dehydrated." But I knew what I'd seen. I grabbed the photo and studied it closely. It had to be at least 80 or 90 years old, but it was unmistakably the same person. My mind reeled, unable to process what this could mean. We called the police, of course. They came and cordoned off the area, started asking questions. But there was little we could tell them. No one knew who the man in the photo was, or how long the coffin had been there. The land had changed hands many times over the decades. I told them about my encounters with the young man, but I could tell they didn't believe me. How could they? It sounded insane even to my own ears, but I knew what I'd seen and heard. Work was halted for a few days while they investigated, but ultimately they just removed the coffin and told us we could resume construction. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I kept seeing him out of the corner of my eye. Just glimpses, a figure moving between the scaffolding, a face in a dusty window. Always gone when I turned to look directly. And at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, his words echoing in my head. "It's important work we're doing, for our children, you know?" What did it mean? Was he trying to warn us about something? Or was his presence itself the warning? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just stress, or some kind of shared delusion brought on by heat and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen him, spoken to him. He was as real as you or me. The project continued, but I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't focus, jumping at every shadow. The other workers started avoiding me, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. I knew they thought I was losing it. Maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something that should have been left alone. That in our rush to build something new, we had awakened something old and powerful. As the weeks went by, strange accidents started happening on site. Equipment would malfunction for no reason. Workers would trip over nothing. Once, an entire section of scaffolding collapsed, narrowly missing a group of men. No one was seriously hurt, but the incidents kept piling up. The crew got more and more nervous. Some quit outright. I knew they blamed me, thought I had brought some kind of curse down on us. I considered abandoning the project altogether, but something kept me there. A need to understand, to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. And always, I felt his eyes on me. It all came to a head about 2 months after we found the coffin. I was working late, going over some paperwork in the site office. The sun had long since set, and the only light came from my desk lamp and the distant glow of the town. Suddenly, the lamp flickered and went out. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to look around. And there he was, standing in the doorway, the young man from the photograph, looking exactly as he had the first time I saw him. I scrambled back, nearly falling out of my chair. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He just looked at me sadly. "I told you," he said softly. "I've been here a long time. This place, it's important, sacred." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Why are you here?" He stepped closer, and I could see that his form was slightly translucent, like a reflection in clouded glass. "We all have our purpose," he said. "Mine is to protect this place, and yours—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "My what?" I pressed. "What's my purpose?" But he was already fading away. As he disappeared, his final words hung in the air. "For the children. Remember the children." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the dark office, my heart pounding. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I found some explanation that made sense of it all. But the truth is, I never did. The young man never appeared again, at least not to me. We finished the hotel, and as far as I know, nothing strange ever happened there. But I've never been able to forget him, or shake the feeling that we disturbed something ancient and powerful. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still hear his whispered words, "For the children. Remember the children." What did he mean? What were we supposed to remember? I don't know. But I do know that there are things in this world that we can't explain, forces we don't understand. And sometimes it's best to leave well enough alone. I left Puerto Lopez soon after we finished the project. I couldn't stand to be there anymore, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if I'd see him again. But no matter where I go, I can't escape the memory of those pale green eyes, or the chill I felt when I realized who or what he really was. So I'm sharing this story now, hoping that someone out there might have answers, or at least to warn others, be careful what you unearth. Some things are buried for a reason. As I turned down a narrow alley, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw him. At first I thought it was just a shadow on the wall. But as I got closer, I realized it was a small boy, no more than 5 or 6 years old. He was standing perfectly still, his back pressed against the crumbling concrete wall. What struck me immediately was how out of place he looked. The boy was wearing nothing but a filthy t-shirt and underwear. His feet were bare and caked with dirt. In the chilly night air, he should have been shivering, but he was motionless. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I approach him? Ask if he was lost or needed help? Before I could decide, the boy's head snapped around to face me. His eyes, God, I'll never forget those eyes. They were pitch black, without any whites visible. They seemed to bore right through me, filled with an intensity no child should possess. A scream caught in my throat as the boy suddenly sprang into motion. But he didn't run like a normal child. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being yanked about by invisible strings. In a flash, he was scaling the wall beside him, his small fingers and toes finding impossible purchase on the smooth surface. I watched in horror as he scrambled up the side of the building with inhuman speed and agility. My legs finally remembered how to work, and I turned to run. But a scraping sound made me look back. The boy had reached a wrought iron fence at the top of the wall. The fence was at least 8 feet high, with wicked-looking spikes along the top. To my utter disbelief, the child slithered through the bars of the fence as if they weren't even there. His body contorted in ways that defied anatomy, twisting and bending around the iron spikes without a scratch. In seconds, he had vanished over the other side of the wall. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. I ran all the way to my grandmother's house, not daring to look back. I burst through her door, gasping for breath and on the verge of tears. My abuela took one look at my pale, terrified face and immediately began burning sage and saying prayers. For days afterward, I was too scared to leave the house after dark. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Had it been a trick of the light? Some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion? When I finally worked up the courage to tell my friends, their reactions were mixed. Some laughed it off, saying I must have been drinking or imagining things. Others got very serious and started talking about duendes, mischievous spirits from Mexican folklore that often take the form of children. One friend even suggested it might have been the ghost of a child who had died in the neighborhood. Tepito has a long history of violence and poverty, so it wasn't out of the question that a young boy might have met a tragic end there. But none of these explanations felt right to me. What I saw that night was too real, too visceral to be a ghost or spirit. The memory of those black eyes still makes my skin crawl. In the years since, I've done a lot of research trying to find similar stories or some kind of rational explanation. I've come across tales of the black-eyed children phenomenon, but those encounters usually involve the children trying to gain entry to homes or cars. What I saw was something altogether different and more terrifying. I've never gone back to that alley, and I avoid Tepito at night whenever possible. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has seen the boy, or if he's still out there, scuttling across walls and slipping through fences like a nightmare come to life. There are times when I almost convince myself it was just a dream or a bizarre hallucination. But then I'll catch a glimpse of a small, dark-haired boy out of the corner of my eye, and my heart will skip a beat. Even in broad daylight, surrounded by people, that primal fear comes rushing back. I know what I saw that night was real. I just wish I could understand what it was and why it chose to reveal itself to me. The not knowing is almost worse than the fear. Almost. To this day, I sleep with a nightlight on and sage burning by my bedside. I've become something of an expert in protective rituals from various cultures, anything to keep that thing at bay. My family thinks I'm paranoid, but they didn't see what I saw. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe again. That one brief encounter changed everything for me. It shattered my understanding of what's possible in this world and opened my eyes to a darkness I never knew existed. I still have nightmares about those black eyes and that impossible, spider-like movement. In my dreams, the boy is always chasing me, getting closer and closer, no matter how fast I run. I always wake up just as his cold, dirty fingers are about to close around my ankle. On my worst days, I find myself obsessively checking dark corners and empty streets, half expecting to see that small, eerie figure watching me. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it. The memory of that night is seared into my brain, a constant reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. I've never told this story publicly before. Part of me is afraid that talking about it might somehow summon that thing back into my life. But another part of me hopes that by sharing my experience, I might find others who have seen similar things. Maybe together we can make sense of the unexplainable. So if you're reading this and you've had a similar encounter, please reach out. And if you find yourself walking alone in Tepito late at night, stay alert. Watch the shadows and listen for the sound of small, bare feet on concrete. And whatever you do, don't look into those eyes. I was just a regular guy working at the Tepito market in Mexico City back in 2010. Nothing special about me really. Eduardo Tejeda, 28 years old, trying to make ends meet like everyone else. But man, let me tell you about this one day that still gives me chills when I think about it. It was a busy Thursday morning in July. The market was packed as usual. I was hauling this huge metal cart loaded up with boxes of merchandise, clothes, knickknacks, all kinds of stuff to stock the stalls. The wheels on that damn cart always stuck, making it a real pain to maneuver through the narrow aisles. I remember it was hot as hell that day, sweat dripping down my back as I pushed that cart along. The noise of the market was deafening, vendors shouting prices, music blaring, people haggling. I was focused on not crashing into anyone when suddenly the front wheel of the cart hit a crack in the concrete. The whole thing started to tip, boxes shifting dangerously. My heart leapt into my throat as I frantically tried to steady it. In that moment of panic, I heard a man's voice right next to my ear. "Careful now, push it this way." The voice was calm, almost soothing. Without thinking, I did what the voice said. I felt a firm hand on my shoulder, guiding me as I righted the cart. The boxes settled back into place, and disaster was averted. I let out a huge sigh of relief, turning to thank whoever had helped me. But there was no one there. I blinked in confusion, looking all around. The aisle was completely empty. How was that possible in the middle of the packed market? I could have sworn I felt a hand on my shoulder, heard that voice as clear as day. A chill ran down my spine despite the heat. I must have looked pretty shaken up, because Jose, one of the older guys who worked security, came over to check on me. "You all right there, Eduardo? Look like you've seen a ghost." I tried to laugh it off, but my voice came out shaky. I think someone just helped me with the cart, but there's no one here." Jose's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly. He glanced around, then leaned in close. "Ah, sounds like you had a run-in with one of the aparecidos." "The what?" I asked, still feeling rattled. "The appeared ones," Jose explained in a low voice. "Spirits that show up to help people. It's not uncommon around here, especially in the older parts of the market." I'd heard whispers about the supposed haunted history of Tepito, but I'd always brushed it off as superstition. Standing there in that empty aisle, though, the hair on the back of my neck standing up, I wasn't so sure anymore. Jose must have sensed my unease. He patted me on the back and said, "Don't worry, mijo. They're friendly spirits. Consider yourself lucky. They say it's good fortune to be helped by an aparecido." I nodded, trying to shake off the weird feeling. I had work to do after all. But as I started pushing the cart again, I couldn't stop replaying what had happened in my mind. That voice had been so real, so close, and that hand on my shoulder, I could still feel the impression of it, like a phantom touch. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went through the motions of my job, unloading boxes and helping customers, but I felt like I was in a daze. Every time I turned a corner or entered a new aisle, I found myself searching for something, someone. But there was never anyone there. As the day went on, I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision. How sometimes I'd catch a whiff of unfamiliar cologne or perfume, gone as quickly as it came. Once, I could have sworn I heard my name being called, but when I looked around, no one was there. By the time my shift ended, I was a nervous wreck. I practically ran out of the market, desperate to get home. But even in the comfort of my own apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains made me jump. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as my mind raced. I kept replaying the incident with the cart over and over. Had I imagined it all? Was I going crazy? Or was Jose right about the aparecidos? The next morning, I seriously considered calling in sick. The thought of going back to the market filled me with dread. But I needed the money, and I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that's all. As I walked into work, though, everything felt different. The familiar sights and sounds of the market seemed somehow off, like I was seeing them through a warped lens. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected noise. Jose caught my eye as I clocked in, giving me a knowing look. "Still rattled from yesterday, hey?" he asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Jose sighed, then motioned for me to follow him. He led me to a quiet corner of the market, well away from the bustle of the main aisles. "Listen, Eduardo," he said, his voice serious. What happened to you yesterday? It's not the first time something like that has occurred here. This market, it's got history. Dark history. He went on to tell me about the brutal crimes that had taken place in Tepito over the years. Murders, disappearances, all sorts of violence. Some say the spirits of those who died here never left, Jose explained. They linger, watching over the market. Most of the time they're harmless, even helpful like your friend yesterday. But sometimes... He trailed off, a shadow passing over his face. I felt my stomach drop. Sometimes what? I pressed. Jose shook his head. Just be careful, okay? If you hear that voice again, or feel anything strange, come find me immediately. I wanted to ask more questions, but Jose hurried off, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I started my work for the day, his words echoed in my head. What did he mean? Be careful. What could a spirit do to me? Throughout the day, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I entered the aisle where I'd had my experience the day before, my heart would start racing. I kept expecting to hear that voice again, to feel that hand on my shoulder. But nothing happened. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that things got weird again. I was restocking a shelf in one of the less busy areas of the market when I felt a sudden chill. The air around me seemed to grow heavy, making it hard to breathe. And then I heard it, that same voice from yesterday, whispering right in my ear, "Behind you." I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, a man in old-fashioned clothes, his face blurry and indistinct. But in the blink of an eye, he was gone. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stood there frozen, unable to move, unable to think. And then I heard a crash from the next aisle over, followed by a woman's scream. Without thinking, I ran towards the sound. I found a young woman sprawled on the ground, surrounded by fallen boxes. She was clutching her ankle, her face twisted in pain. As I helped her up, I realized with a jolt what had happened. If I hadn't turned around when I did, if I hadn't heard that warning, those boxes would have fallen on me instead. The rest of the day passed in a daze. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Had the spirit saved me again? Why me? What did it want? When I finally got home that night, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I spent hours researching the history of Tepito Market, reading about its reputation as one of the most haunted places in Mexico City. The stories I found chilled me to the bone. Tales of ghostly figures seen wandering the aisles after hours, of mysterious voices heard in empty stalls, of objects moving on their own. But what struck me most were the accounts of people who, like me, had been helped by unseen forces. A woman who was pulled back from stepping into the path of a speeding car. A child who was guided back to his mother after getting lost in the crowd. Over and over, stories of the aparecidos coming to the aid of those in need. As the weeks passed, I found myself becoming hyper-aware of my surroundings at the market. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Cold spots in certain areas, the way some of the older vendors would make the sign of the cross before opening their stalls, the protective amulets hidden under counters. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure that vanished when I turned to look. A face in a mirror that wasn't my own. Once, I even heard what sounded like distant echoing laughter coming from an empty storage room. But I never heard that voice again, never felt that guiding hand. Part of me was relieved, but another part almost missed it. As crazy as it sounds, I found myself hoping for another encounter, another chance to communicate with whatever or whoever had helped me. It's been years now since that day in 2010, but I still work at Tepito Market. People often ask me why I stay, given its reputation. I usually just shrug and say I'm used to it, but the truth is, I feel safe there now, protected. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the market is nearly empty, I'll find myself standing in that aisle where it all began, and I'll whisper a quiet thank you to the empty air. I never get a response, but that's okay. I know they're listening. The aparecidos of Tepito Market, watching over us all. Now, I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life. I know its reputation, the crime, the danger, all that stuff the news likes to talk about. But to me, it's just home. I've walked these streets 1,000 times without incident. Still, something felt off that night. The air was thick and heavy, like right before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear, stars twinkling overhead. I remember checking my watch, 1:17 a.m. The streets were deserted, which wasn't unusual for that time of night, but the silence was eerie. No distant traffic, no dogs barking, not even the hum of air conditioners. Just the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the buildings. I picked up my pace a bit, eager to get home. That's when I heard it, another set of footsteps coming up fast behind me. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, fists clenched, ready to face whoever was there. "Whoa, easy there, amigo." It was Miguel, an old friend from school. He was out of breath, like he'd been running. "Man, am I glad I caught up to you. You wouldn't believe what I just saw." I relaxed a bit, but something about Miguel's expression kept me on edge. His eyes were wide, darting around like he expected something to jump out at us any second. "What's going on, Miguel?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He grabbed my arm, pulling me close. "Javier, I don't know how to explain this. I was walking home from the bar, and I saw you up ahead. I was going to call out, but then I noticed there was someone with you." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I've been alone all night." Miguel shook his head vigorously. No, I swear to you, there was a woman walking right behind you, like impossibly close. She was practically pressed up against your back. A chill ran down my spine. "Miguel, that's impossible. I would have felt someone that close to me." But he was insistent. "I know what I saw, Javier. She was short, maybe up to your shoulders, long black hair hanging down over her face. She was wearing this white dress, old-fashioned looking, and the way she moved, it wasn't natural, like she was gliding instead of walking. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Miguel, if this is some kind of joke—" "No joke, I swear on my mother's life," he said, crossing himself. I blinked, and suddenly she was gone. That's when I started running to catch up with you. We both looked around, searching the empty street. There was no sign of anyone else, let alone a woman in a white dress. Let's keep walking," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "My place isn't far." We set off together, both of us glancing over our shoulders every few steps. The silence that had seemed eerie before now felt oppressive, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. As we walked, Miguel kept talking, his words tumbling out in a nervous rush. He described the woman in more detail, how her dress seemed to shimmer in the streetlights, how her hair moved even though there was no wind, and her face, or rather the lack of it. Miguel swore that when he tried to get a good look at her features, all he saw was shadow where her face should have been. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Miguel had had too much to drink at the bar. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow that looked like a person for a split second. but the fear in his voice, the way his hands shook as he talked, it was hard to dismiss. We were about a block from my apartment when it happened. A streetlight ahead of us flickered and went out. In that moment of darkness, I felt something, a presence right behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I whirled around, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But there was nothing there, just the empty street stretching out behind us. Miguel had frozen in place, his face pale as a sheet. Did you feel that?" he whispered. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We practically ran the rest of the way to my building, slamming the front door behind us and taking the stairs 2 at a time. Once we were safely inside my apartment, we both collapsed onto the couch, breathing hard. For a long time, neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We had both experienced something we couldn't explain, something that defied logic and reason. Finally, Miguel broke the silence. "What do you think it was, Javier? A ghost? Some kind of demon?" I shook my head. "I don't know, man. I just don't know." We stayed up the rest of the night, jumping at every little sound, neither of us willing to be alone. When the sun finally came up, it felt like waking from a nightmare. But the memory of that presence, that cold breath on my neck, lingered. In the days that followed, we tried to find some explanation for what had happened. We asked around the neighborhood, wondering if anyone else had seen the woman in white, but no one had any answers. Some of the older folks crossed themselves and muttered about La Llorona, the legendary ghost said to haunt Mexico. Others just laughed it off, telling us we'd had too much to drink or were working too hard. But Miguel and I knew what we had experienced. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home that night. Sometimes, when I'm walking alone after dark, I'll catch a glimpse of something white out of the corner of my eye, or I'll feel that cold presence behind me, so close I can almost feel ghostly fingers reaching for my shoulder. I don't walk home alone anymore if I can help it, and I always check over my shoulder, half expecting to see a woman in white, with long black hair hiding her face, walking impossibly close behind me. The streets of Tepito hold many secrets, many dangers, but now I know that not all of them are from this world. And sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see, it's what you can't. I still remember that day in Tepito Market like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. The sights, sounds, and smells are seared into my memory. My name is Miguel Jimenez, and back in 2003, I was a young man of 23, working as a vendor in Mexico City's notorious Tepito Market. It was a tough place to make a living, but I did what I had to do to support my family. Every day was a hustle, trying to sell whatever goods I could get my hands on. Some days were better than others, but it was always a struggle. One of the few bright spots in my daily grind was an elderly woman who ran a small food stand near my stall. She must have been in her 70s, with gray hair always neatly tied back and a kind, weathered face that showed the hardships she'd endured over the years. I never knew her name, but she took a liking to me for some reason. Maybe I reminded her of a grandson or something. Whatever the case, she would often offer me a free meal when business was slow, waving away my attempts to pay. "Eat, eat. A growing boy needs his strength," she'd say, with a grandmotherly smile. Her tamales were the best I'd ever tasted, somehow always perfectly moist and flavorful. This routine went on for months, and I came to look forward to our brief interactions. She didn't say much, but her presence was comforting in the chaotic market. Just a kind soul looking out for a young man far from home. It was a Tuesday in late October when everything changed. The market was especially busy that day, with Day of the Dead approaching and everyone scrambling to get supplies for their ofrendas. I hadn't had a chance to take a break all morning, my stomach growling as I rushed between customers. As I hurried past the old woman's stand, she called out to me. "Miguel, come," she said, waving me over. I started to refuse, not wanting to lose any potential sales, but she was insistent. "Just for a moment, Niño." I jogged over and she pressed a warm package into my hands. The familiar smell of her tamales wafted up, making my mouth water instantly. "You need to eat," she said firmly. "Take these with you, no arguments." I thanked her profusely, promising to pay her back when things slowed down. She just smiled and shooed me away. Go, your customers are waiting." The rest of the day passed in a blur of haggling and transactions. It wasn't until I was packing up my stall that I realized I'd never gotten a chance to return to the old woman's stand. I felt a pang of guilt, resolving to make it up to her the next day. But when I arrived at the market Wednesday morning, her stall was eerily empty. At first, I thought maybe she was just running late. But as the hours ticked by and she didn't appear, I started to worry. It wasn't like her to miss a day of work. I asked around, but no one seemed to know anything. Finally, one of the older vendors pulled me aside. "You're asking about the tamale lady?" he said in a low voice. "Miguel. She passed away last week. The funeral was 6 days ago." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "That's impossible," I stammered. "I just saw her yesterday. She gave me food." The old man shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, muchacho, but I was at the funeral myself. She's gone." My mind was reeling. How could this be? I'd seen her clear as day, heard her voice, felt the warmth of the food she'd pressed into my hands. It wasn't possible. In a daze, I wandered back to my stall. As I mindlessly began setting up, my hand brushed against something in my bag. I pulled it out, my blood running cold as I recognized the package the old woman had given me the day before. With trembling fingers, I unwrapped it. Inside were 3 perfect tamales, still somehow warm to the touch. The smell that wafted up was unmistakable, her signature recipe that I'd enjoyed so many times before. A chill ran down my spine as the full weight of the situation hit me. I'd received food from a dead woman, not just any dead woman, but one who had shown me kindness for months, who had looked out for me when no one else did. I couldn't bring myself to eat the tamales. Instead, I carefully wrapped them back up and tucked them away. Part of me wanted to throw them out, to pretend none of this had happened, but I couldn't. They were the last tangible connection I had to the kind old woman who had brightened so many of my days. For weeks after, I was on edge every time I went to the market. I kept expecting to see her, to hear her calling out to me, but her stall remained empty, eventually being taken over by someone else selling cheap plastic toys. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, my mind playing tricks on me after a long, stressful day. Or perhaps it had been someone else, a relative of hers I'd mistaken for her in my hurry. But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd seen her, as real and solid as anyone else in the market that day. And she'd given me one last gift, a final act of kindness from beyond the grave. Years have passed, and I've long since left Tepito behind for a more stable job. But I've never forgotten that day or the mysterious encounter that defied explanation. Sometimes when I'm feeling particularly low or stressed, I swear I can smell the faint aroma of those tamales, a ghostly reminder of the kindness of strangers, and the mysteries that exist just beyond our understanding. I've never told many people this story. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced that day in Tepito Market. And while it still sends a shiver down my spine to think about, I'm grateful for that final encounter with the nameless old woman who looked out for me when I needed it most. To this day, I can't explain what happened. Was it a miracle, a glimpse beyond the veil, or simply a trick of an overworked mind? I don't have the answers, but I do know that every year on Dia de los Muertos, I set out a plate of tamales on my ofrenda. It's my way of saying thank you to the kind soul who watched over me in life, and perhaps for one inexplicable moment, in death as well. I had always been a skeptical person, never believing in the supernatural or anything that couldn't be explained by science. But what happened to me a few years ago shook my beliefs to the core and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. It all started when I was 20 years old and madly in love with my girlfriend Maria. We had been dating for about a year, but lately I had become consumed with jealousy and suspicion. Maria was a free spirit who loved to go out dancing and partying with her friends. I trusted her, but I couldn't help wondering what she was up to when I wasn't around. One day, I was venting to my friend Carlos about my insecurities. He listened sympathetically and then leaned in close, lowering his voice. "You know, there might be a way you can keep an eye on her without her knowing," he said with a glint in his eye. I was intrigued, but skeptical. "What do you mean?" I asked. Carlos told me about a mysterious man in the Tepito market who was rumored to have supernatural abilities. According to the stories, this man could create voodoo dolls that allowed you to spy on people from afar. I scoffed at first. It sounded ridiculous. But as Carlos described it more, a part of me became curious. What if it actually worked? Against my better judgment, I decided to seek out this man and see for myself. The next day, I made my way to the sprawling Tepito market, famous for its contraband goods and shady dealings. I wandered through the maze-like alleys, past stalls selling knockoff designer clothes and pirated DVDs. Finally, I spotted a small booth tucked away in a dim corner, with strange symbols painted on the walls. An old man with piercing eyes sat inside, regarding me coolly as I approached. My heart was pounding, but I managed to stammer out that I had heard he could make special dolls. He nodded slowly, not saying a word. Then he held out his hand expectantly. I realized he wanted payment up front. With shaking hands, I pulled out a wad of cash and placed it in his wrinkled palm. Only then did he speak, his voice a dry rasp. "Bring me something of hers, hair, nail clippings, a personal item, then come back tomorrow." I nodded and hurried away, feeling both excited and ashamed. That night, I snuck into Maria's apartment while she was out and collected some strands of hair from her hairbrush. I also took one of her favorite hair ties, hoping it would make the doll more effective. The next day, I returned to the old man's stall with my stolen items. Without a word, he took them and disappeared into the back. I waited nervously for what felt like hours. Finally, he emerged holding a small cloth doll. It was crudely made, with button eyes and yarn for hair. But as I held it, I felt a strange tingling sensation, as if it were faintly alive. The old man gave me instructions in a low voice. "The doll will move as she moves, but it will only work for 1 hour each night. Choose your time wisely." Then he shooed me away, already turning to the next customer. I rushed home, my mind racing. Part of me still didn't believe it would actually work. But that night, at exactly midnight, I sat the doll on my desk and waited. For several long minutes, nothing happened. I was just about to give up when suddenly the doll's arm twitched. I gasped and leaned closer. The doll was moving on its own in small, jerky motions. Its head turned slightly, then an arm raised. It was as if an invisible puppeteer was manipulating it. With a jolt, I realized I was seeing Maria's movements in real time. My hands shook as I watched the doll. Was Maria getting ready for bed, going out, meeting someone? The movements were hard to interpret, but I was transfixed. When the hour was up, the doll abruptly went still. I sat back, my mind reeling from what I had witnessed. This became my nightly ritual. Every night at midnight, I would sit and watch the doll's movements for exactly 1 hour. Sometimes it would barely move at all. Maria must be sleeping. Other nights, it would be quite active, and I would agonize over what she might be doing. I became obsessed, structuring my whole life around that 1 hour each night. I started sleeping during the day so I could stay up and watch the doll. My studies suffered, and I withdrew from friends. Maria noticed the change in me and grew concerned, but I brushed off her questions. As the weeks went by, my jealousy and paranoia only grew worse. Every little movement of the doll sent my imagination into overdrive. Was she hugging someone? Dancing with another man? I created elaborate scenarios in my head, torturing myself with possibilities. Looking back, I can see how unhinged I had become. But at the time, it felt completely justified. I was convinced the doll was showing me the truth about Maria's secret life. Things came to a head about 2 months after I got the doll. One night, its movements seemed especially vigorous. In my paranoid state, I became convinced Maria was being intimate with someone else. I completely lost it, calling her phone over and over and leaving angry voicemails accusing her of cheating. When Maria finally called me back, she was in tears, completely baffled by my accusations. She had been at a cousin's wedding, dancing and celebrating with family. As she described her night, it matched perfectly with the doll's movements. The truth of what I had done came crashing down on me. Horrified by how far I had fallen, I confessed everything to Maria. She was understandably furious and hurt that I had violated her privacy so egregiously. She broke up with me on the spot, saying she could never trust me again. I didn't blame her one bit. The next day, I returned to the market to find the old man. I needed to end this, to get rid of the cursed doll for good. But when I arrived at the spot where his stall had been, there was nothing there. I asked around, but no one seemed to remember any such vendor. It was as if he had never existed. I ended up burning the doll, hoping that would break whatever spell it was under. The relationship with Maria was over, but at least I could try to move on with my life. It's been years now, but I still think about that doll sometimes. The memory of it moving on its own still sends chills down my spine. I've never been able to fully explain or rationalize what happened. Was it all an elaborate trick? Some kind of remote-controlled device? Or was it truly something supernatural? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, but the experience taught me some hard lessons about trust, jealousy, and respecting others' privacy. I'd like to say I'm a better person now, but the truth is, I'm still haunted by what I did. The image of that doll moving by itself is seared into my memory forever, a constant reminder of how far I once strayed from my principles. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself glancing nervously at dolls or stuffed animals, half expecting to see them twitch or move. It's a fear I don't think will ever fully go away. All I can do is try to live my life with more wisdom and empathy, and hope that I never again let my worst impulses lead me down such a dark path. I was 26 years old and 7 months pregnant with my first child when the incident occurred. It was a crisp autumn morning in September 2001, and I remember feeling particularly exhausted that day. My husband Tom had left for work early as usual, kissing me goodbye around 6 a.m. before heading to the construction site where he was overseeing a project. I dozed off again after he left, only to be woken up by a wave of nausea around 8:30 a.m. Pregnancy had been rough on me, with constant morning sickness and fatigue. I slowly made my way to the bathroom, splashing some cold water on my face to shake off the grogginess. As I walked back towards our small bedroom, I heard noises coming from the kitchen, the clink of a mug, the scrape of a chair against the linoleum floor. My heart started racing. Was there an intruder in the house? I cautiously peeked around the corner into the hallway. To my utter shock, I saw Tom walking out of the kitchen, coffee mug in hand. He looked exactly as he had when he left that morning. Work boots, jeans, flannel shirt. But how could he be here? He should have been at work for over 2 hours by now. "Tom?" I called out hesitantly. "What are you doing home?" He turned and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, concern mixed with something else. "Hey, honey," he said softly. "I'm worried about the baby. I think we need to get you to the doctor today." A chill ran down my spine. "What? Why? Is something wrong?" Tom set his mug down on the hall table. "I just have a bad feeling. Please promise me you'll make an appointment today, okay? For my peace of mind." I nodded, still trying to process what was happening. "Oh, okay, I will. But Tom, why aren't you at work? Did something happen at the site?" He gave me a strange look. "I have to go now. Remember, call the doctor. It's important." And with that he turned and walked back towards the kitchen. I followed him, my mind reeling. "Tom, wait, what's going on?" But when I entered the kitchen, it was completely empty. The chair was pushed in. There was no coffee mug in the sink. It was as if he had never been there at all. I stood frozen, my hands shaking. What had just happened? Was I losing my mind? The pregnancy hormones must be messing with me, I thought. Maybe I was still half asleep and had imagined the whole thing. I pinched myself hard, wincing at the pain. No, I was definitely awake. I walked around the small kitchen, opening cabinets and peering behind the pantry door, half expecting Tom to jump out and yell, "Surprise!" But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sank down into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. The baby gave a strong kick, as if sensing my distress. I placed a hand on my swollen belly, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's okay," I whispered, more to myself than the baby. "Mommy's just tired. Everything's fine." But even as I said the words, I knew something was very wrong. The encounter had felt so real. I could still smell Tom's cologne lingering in the air. And why would I hallucinate such a specific and strange interaction? I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Tom's work number. Maybe he really had come home, and I just hadn't heard him leave again. Maybe there was a logical explanation for all of this. The phone rang several times before Tom's gruff voice came on the line. "Hello? Tom?" I said, my voice cracking. "Are you at work?" "Yeah, of course. Where else would I be?" He sounded confused. "Is everything okay? You sound upset." I swallowed hard. I thought I saw you here at the house just now. You came out of the kitchen and told me to make a doctor's appointment for the baby." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Tom spoke again, his voice was low and strained. That's impossible. I've been here all morning, but listen, this is really weird. I dozed off at my desk for a few minutes and had the strangest dream. I dreamt I was back at the house, telling you to go to the doctor. I was really worried about you and the baby in the dream. A chill ran through me. Tom, that's exactly what happened here. Or what I thought happened. I don't understand. Me neither, he said slowly. But maybe we should listen to whatever this is. Can you call the doctor and see if they can fit you in today, just to be safe? I agreed, still shaken. We said our goodbyes, and I immediately called my OB/GYN's office. To my surprise, they had a cancellation and could see me in 2 hours. I got dressed in a daze, my mind still trying to make sense of what had transpired that morning. The drive to the doctor's office was a blur. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, searching for some explanation. Was it a ghost, a premonition, or just pregnancy-induced insanity? When I arrived, the nurse took my vitals and asked routine questions. Everything seemed normal, which only increased my anxiety. What if I was here for nothing? What if I really was losing my mind? But when Dr. Anderson came in and began the examination, her brow furrowed. She pressed gently on my abdomen, asking if I felt any pain or discomfort. I shook my head, growing more worried by the second. "I'm going to do an ultrasound," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I just want to check on a few things." As she moved the wand over my belly, I could see her expression grow more serious. After what felt like an eternity, she turned off the machine and faced me. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm very glad you came in today," she said gravely. "You're in the early stages of a uterine infection. If left untreated, it could have become very serious for both you and the baby." My breath caught in my throat. How serious? Dr. Anderson's eyes met mine. "Potentially life-threatening. But we've caught it early, which is crucial. We'll start you on antibiotics immediately, and I want to see you back here in 3 days for a follow-up." I nodded numbly, barely hearing the rest of her instructions. All I could think about was the strange visitation that morning. If it hadn't happened, if I hadn't made this appointment, how long would it have been before I realized something was wrong? As I left the office with my prescription in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly unexplainable had occurred. Whatever force, entity, or cosmic intervention had appeared in my kitchen that morning hadn't just been a hallucination or a dream. It had saved my baby's life, and possibly my own. In the years since, I've turned the event over in my mind countless times. I've researched similar phenomena, spoken to psychics and paranormal experts, but never found a satisfactory explanation. Tom and I rarely talk about it now. It's become one of those family stories that seems too fantastical to be true, yet too real to be dismissed. Our daughter is 22 now, healthy and thriving. Sometimes when I look at her, I'm overwhelmed by how close we came to losing her before she even had a chance at life. And I'm filled with gratitude for whatever mysterious force intervened that autumn morning in 2001. I don't know if it was a ghost, an angel, or some kind of temporal anomaly. But I do know this. Sometimes the universe sends us messages in the strangest ways. And when it does, we'd better listen. It was a warm July evening when we piled into my cousin's old pickup truck. There were 4 of us, me, my 2 cousins Miguel and Rosa's boyfriend Carlos. Miguel was driving, with Rosa in the passenger seat giving directions. Carlos and I were in the back, enjoying the breeze as we cruised down dusty back roads. As night fell, we found ourselves on a lonely dirt road somewhere near San Pedro de Rosales. The stars were coming out, and apart from our headlights, there was nothing but darkness all around. We were laughing and joking, the radio playing ranchera music. Suddenly, Miguel tensed up. "Shit, cops," he muttered, turning down the radio. He pointed to a small device on the dashboard that was flashing and beeping. "Radar detector," he explained. "Lets us know when there's police nearby." We all went quiet, peering out the windows for any sign of a patrol car. After a few minutes with no police in sight, we started to relax again. But the detector kept going off intermittently, which was odd. "Probably just malfunctioning," Carlos said with a shrug. We tried to shake off our unease and enjoy the ride. About 20 minutes later, we rounded a bend and saw flashing lights in the distance. "Crap, it's a checkpoint," Rosa said. Miguel slowed down as we approached what looked like a police cruiser, parked sideways across the road, lights blazing. As we got closer, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something seemed off. The car was completely silent, no idling engine, no radio chatter, and there didn't seem to be any officers around it. Miguel pulled to a stop about 50 feet away. We all stared at the vacant police car, unsure what to do. After a minute of tense silence, Miguel called out, "Hello? Officers?" No response. "Maybe they're checking something in the bushes?" I suggested half-heartedly. Miguel inched the truck forward slowly. As we drew alongside the cruiser, we could see it was completely empty. The doors were closed, but no one was inside. "What the hell?" Carlos muttered. Suddenly the cruiser's lights shut off, plunging us into darkness. We all yelped in surprise. Miguel fumbled to turn on the high beams. When the lights came on, the police car was gone, vanished into thin air. We sat there in stunned silence for several seconds, trying to process what just happened. The road stretched empty in both directions. There were no turnoffs or side roads nearby, just flat scrubland as far as the eye could see. Did we all see that?" I stammered. Everyone nodded mutely, eyes wide with disbelief. "Let's get out of here," Rosa said, her voice shaking. Miguel didn't need to be told twice. He threw the truck in gear and we peeled out, kicking up a cloud of dust. We'd gone maybe half a mile when the radar detector started going crazy again, beeping frantically. Miguel swore and checked the rearview mirror. "There's nothing back there," he yelled in frustration. But the detector kept sounding, as if we were being pursued by an invisible police car. We were all on edge, jumping at every shadow and sound. Suddenly, there was a loud thump on the hood of the truck. We all screamed. Miguel slammed on the brakes, nearly sending Carlos and me flying out of the back. "What the fuck was that?" Carlos yelled. I don't know," Miguel shouted back. He turned on the cabin light and we all looked around wildly. There was nothing there, no dents on the hood, no signs of impact, just that bone-chilling thump like a heavy hand slamming down on metal. Rosa was hyperventilating. We need to go now," she cried. Miguel floored it again. We tore down that dirt road like bats out of hell, the truck bouncing and rattling. All the while, that damn detector kept beeping as if something was right on our tail. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, we finally saw lights in the distance. Civilization. As we neared town, the detector finally fell silent. We all breathed a collective sigh of relief. Miguel pulled over at a gas station on the outskirts of town. We all piled out on shaky legs, still too rattled to speak. After a few minutes of standing around in shocked silence, Rosa finally spoke up. I need to tell you guys something," she said quietly. We all turned to look at her. "The house I was going to show you tonight, It's where a group of police officers were ambushed and killed a few years ago. I thought it would be spooky to check out, but now a chill ran through me as the implications sank in. Had we encountered the ghosts of those murdered cops? Were they trying to warn us away, or something more sinister? We ended up driving straight back to my cousin's house in Culiacan that night. None of us wanted to be out on those lonely roads anymore. For the rest of my visit, we stuck to well-lit city streets and crowded tourist areas. It's been almost a year, and I still get nightmares about that night sometimes. The ghostly police car, the phantom thump on the hood, the relentless beeping of that radar detector. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened out there in the Sinaloan countryside. But I know one thing for certain. I'm never taking another night drive down a deserted Mexican back road again. Sometimes I wonder if those restless spirits are still out there, patrolling that stretch of road, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers to wander into their supernatural speed trap. If you ever find yourself driving through rural Sinaloa at night and see flashing lights in your rearview mirror, well, you might want to think twice before pulling over. I've never met my neighbor, but I've always been curious about the old man who lives in the run-down house at the end of our street in Guadalupe. Locals call him the Witch, though I'm not sure why. He keeps to himself and rarely leaves home. Still, there's something unsettling about that place. One night, I was walking my dog past his house when I noticed flickering candlelight through a crack in the boarded-up windows. Shadows danced on the walls inside. As I paused to look, my dog started whimpering and pulling at the leash. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural chanting coming from within. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickened my pace to get away from there, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. The old man would occasionally emerge late at night, always wearing the same ratty black coat. He'd shuffle down the street with a large sack slung over his shoulder, returning hours later empty-handed. My curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, while he was out, I crept up to peek through a gap in the boarded windows. What I saw made my blood run cold. The interior walls were covered in strange symbols painted in what looked like blood. Candles and creepy figurines were everywhere. In the center of the room was a crude altar with more of those disturbing statues. I jerked back, heart racing. As I turned to leave, I came face to face with the old man himself. How long had he been standing there? His eyes bored into me with an intensity that made me shudder. Without a word, he brushed past me and went inside, slamming the door. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window. When I looked outside, dozens of black chickens were crowded on my lawn, pecking at the ground. But that was impossible. We didn't have wild chickens in our neighborhood. As I watched in disbelief, they all turned to stare at me in unison, with glowing red eyes. I blinked and they vanished. Was I going crazy? The next morning, I found strange symbols carved into my front door. My neighbors reported similar occurrences, inexplicable noises at night, glimpses of shadowy figures, pets acting terrified for no reason. We tried reporting it to the police, but they just laughed it off. With no proof, what could they do? But we all knew something was very wrong. People started avoiding walking near the old man's house. Children were kept indoors after dark. An atmosphere of fear settled over the neighborhood. Things escalated about a week later. I was in my kitchen when I heard a woman's blood-curdling scream from down the street. I ran outside to see a crowd gathered in front of the old man's house. My neighbor Louisa was sobbing hysterically, saying her 5-year-old son had vanished while playing in the front yard. As we stood there in shock, the old man emerged from his house. He surveyed the crowd with those piercing eyes lingering on each face. When his gaze met mine, a chill went through me. There was something inhuman in those eyes. He gave a slight smirk before going back inside. The police searched everywhere but found no trace of the missing boy. They questioned the old man, but he claimed to know nothing. Without evidence, they couldn't do much. But we all knew. In the days that followed, more children disappeared, always when they were alone, always without a trace. The neighborhood was in a panic. Parents were afraid to let their kids out of sight. We started hearing strange chanting from the old man's house at night, along with what sounded like animals being slaughtered. The stench of death hung in the air. A group of us decided we had to take matters into our own hands. We gathered outside his house one night, armed with whatever weapons we could find. The plan was to force our way in and make him tell us what he'd done with the children. But as we approached, an unnatural fog rolled in out of nowhere. The temperature plummeted. That's when we saw them, dark shapes moving in the mist. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. As they got closer, we could make out glowing red eyes and elongated limbs. We ran. I've never been so terrified in my life. Whatever those things were, they weren't natural. Somehow I made it home and barricaded myself inside. All night long I heard inhuman shrieks and screams from outside. When morning came, half the neighborhood was just gone. Houses stood empty, possessions left behind as if people had simply vanished. The old man's house was empty too. No trace of him or the missing children was ever found. The police were baffled. Those of us who remained were too scared to talk about what we'd seen. We just wanted to forget. It's been years, but I still have nightmares about those glowing red eyes in the fog. I've tried to convince myself it was all just mass hysteria, that there must be a rational explanation. But deep down, I know the truth. Something evil came to our quiet neighborhood, and even though it's gone now, I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. I often wonder about those missing children and what became of them. Did the old man really steal them away for some dark purpose? Or was he just a conduit for something far worse? I suppose I'll never know for sure, but I'll always regret not acting sooner before it was too late. All I can do now is try to warn others. Evil can hide in plain sight, and once it takes root, it may already be too late to stop it. It was a typical evening in our quiet neighborhood. My wife Maria and I had just put our 2-year-old daughter Isabella to bed and were relaxing on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. That's when we heard the blood-curdling scream from next door. Without hesitation, I sprinted towards our neighbor Elena's house. The front door was wide open, and I could hear her hysterical cries coming from upstairs. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding in my chest. I found Elena in her baby's nursery, clutching her infant son Diego tightly to her chest. She was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the panic rising in my throat. Elena's words came out in a frantic jumble. "A bird, a massive bird. It tried to take Diego, but it wasn't just a bird. It had a face, a human face." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, a human face?" She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. It was Lucia. The bird had Lucia's face. I knew of Lucia, an eccentric older woman who lived at the edge of town. There had always been whispers about her practicing witchcraft, but I had dismissed them as silly gossip. Now I wasn't so sure. Elena continued, her voice trembling. I was about to lay Diego down in his crib when I heard a strange sound at the window. When I turned around, I saw this thing. It was enormous, with feathers as black as night. But its face, oh God, its face was Lucia's. Those cold, dark eyes, that crooked nose, I'll never forget it. She broke down sobbing, clutching Diego even tighter. I put a comforting hand on her shoulder, trying to process what I was hearing. It seemed impossible, and yet the fear in Elena's eyes was all too real. It reached out with its talons, she continued, trying to snatch Diego from my arms. I screamed and stumbled backward. That's when you came running. I spent the next hour comforting Elena and helping her secure the house. We called the police, but I could tell from their expressions that they didn't believe her story. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but left without taking any real action. As I walked home, my mind was reeling. I wanted to dismiss Elena's story as the product of an overactive imagination, or maybe a vivid nightmare. But something deep in my gut told me this was real. The next morning, I woke up early and headed straight to Lucia's house. I needed answers, needed to confront her about what had happened. But when I arrived, I found the small, dilapidated cottage completely abandoned. It looked like she had left in a hurry. Drawers were left open, clothes strewn about. As I stood there, staring at the empty house, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Don Miguel, Elena's husband, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "She's gone," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Ran away like the coward she is. But I'll find her. I swear I'll find her and make her pay for what she tried to do to my son." I tried to calm him down, to suggest that maybe there was some kind of explanation. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they rang hollow. We both knew something unnatural had occurred last night. Over the next few days, the story spread through Desamparados like wildfire. More people came forward with their own strange experiences involving Lucia. One elderly man claimed he had seen her transform into a cat and slink away into the night. A group of children swore they had seen her speaking to birds in a language they couldn't understand. The local priest held a special mass to pray for protection against evil forces. People began hanging crucifixes and evil eye amulets in their windows. The once peaceful neighborhood was gripped by a palpable sense of fear and suspicion. I found myself unable to sleep, constantly checking on Isabella throughout the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image Elena had described, a monstrous bird with Lucia's face, its talons reaching out to snatch away an innocent child. A week after the incident, I was in the backyard, absent-mindedly weeding the garden, when I noticed something strange. There was an unusual number of birds gathered in the trees surrounding our property. Crows, ravens, and other blackbirds I couldn't identify. They seemed to be watching me, their beady eyes following my every move. As I stood up to get a better look, they all took flight at once, creating a deafening cacophony of caws and screeches. The sky darkened as they swirled overhead, forming a massive, writhing black cloud. And then, for just a split second, I swear I saw a face in that swirling mass of feathers and beaks. A human face with cold, dark eyes and a crooked nose. Lucia's face. I ran into the house, slamming the door behind me. Maria found me huddled on the kitchen floor, shaking and muttering incoherently about birds and witches. She thought I was having some kind of breakdown, and honestly, part of me wondered if she was right. That night, as we lay in bed, Maria trying to comfort me, we heard Isabella cry out from her room. We both bolted upright, exchanging terrified glances before rushing to her room. Isabella was standing in her crib, pointing at the window with a chubby little finger. "Bird lady," she said, her voice a mix of fear and curiosity. I felt my blood run cold as I approached the window. There, perched on a branch of the tree outside, was the largest bird I had ever seen. Its feathers were so black they seemed to absorb the moonlight. And its face, God help me, its face was unmistakably human. For a moment we locked eyes. I saw recognition in those cold, dark orbs. Then, with a screech that sounded almost like laughter, it spread its massive wings and took flight, disappearing into the night sky. Maria didn't see it. By the time she reached the window, it was gone. She tried to convince me it was just a nightmare, that the stress of the past week had gotten to me. But I knew what I saw. And more importantly, Isabella saw it too. The next day I went to the local library and started researching. I found old legends about shape-shifting witches, about women who could transform into birds to carry out their evil deeds. The stories spanned cultures and continents, from the Strix of ancient Rome to the Tluicamina of Aztec mythology. As I delved deeper into these dark tales, I began to understand the true nature of what we were dealing with. Lucia wasn't just some local witch. She was something far more ancient and terrible. Weeks passed, and slowly, life in Desamparados began to return to normal. There were no more sightings of the bird witch, no more attempted kidnappings. But the fear lingered, like a shadow at the edge of our vision. I still check on Isabella multiple times each night. I still flinch at the sound of birds outside our window. And sometimes, when the moon is full and the night is quiet, I swear I can hear the beat of massive wings in the distance. Lucia is still out there somewhere. I don't know if she'll ever return to Desamparados, if she'll ever try to take another child. But I do know this. I'll be ready if she does. Because now I understand the truth about our world, about the dark forces that exist just beyond the veil of what we consider normal. And I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family from the bird witch of Costa Rica. I've been a paranormal investigator for over a decade now, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last Thursday. My name's Nathan, and I work for a small outfit in northern Mexico that specializes in supernatural cases. We often team up with local priests in Nuevo León to handle reports of possessions and other unexplained phenomena. It was supposed to be a routine call, an elderly woman experiencing some odd occurrences in her home. But from the moment I stepped into Doña Carmen's crumbling adobe house on the outskirts of Monterrey, I knew something was different about this case. The 89-year-old widow greeted me at the door, her eyes clouded with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence. "Gracias a Dios you're here," she muttered, crossing herself. "It started in the baño. I thought I was going loca, but Father Miguel said to call you." I nodded, setting down my equipment bag. "Can you tell me more about what you've been experiencing, Doña Carmen?" She shuddered, wrapping her shawl tighter. Voices, whispers in the night, things moving on their own, and the temperature, it's like ice in there, even when it's boiling outside. Classic signs of a haunting, but there was an urgency in her voice that put me on edge. I've dealt with hundreds of cases over the years, Most turn out to have perfectly ordinary explanations. Creaky pipes, drafty windows, overactive imaginations. But occasionally, we encounter something truly inexplicable. I did a preliminary sweep of the small house, EMF meter in hand. Nothing out of the ordinary until I approached the bathroom door. The needle spiked, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the suddenly frigid air. "Doña Carmen, when did this all start?" I called out, not taking my eyes off the closed door. 3 weeks ago," she replied from the kitchen, "right after my Elena passed." I made a mental note. Recent deaths can sometimes trigger paranormal activity. "And the problems are only in the bathroom?" "See, only there. I can't go in anymore." Her voice quavered. Taking a deep breath, I turned the doorknob. The bathroom was tiny, just a toilet, sink, and shower stall. But the air felt thick, oppressive. My breath fogged in front of me, despite the sweltering heat outside. I set up a night vision camera in the corner and began taking readings. The EMF was off the charts, and the thermal imaging camera showed wild temperature fluctuations. As I worked, I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, the shower curtain rustled. I whirled around, heart pounding. Nothing there. But as I turned back, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror, a dark shape, just for a second. I blinked, and it was gone. "Doña Carmen?" I called out, my voice shakier than I'd like to admit. "Has anyone else witnessed the activity here?" "No, senor," she replied. "I live alone since my Elena died. The priest came, but nothing happened while he was here." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. That's often how it goes. The entities, whatever they are, tend to shy away from outsiders. I was lucky, in a way, to be experiencing this firsthand. But the rational part of my brain was screaming that this was wrong, that I needed to get out. I ignored it and continued my investigation. Over the next few hours, I witnessed phenomena that defied explanation. The faucet turned on by itself, gushing ice-cold water. The mirror fogged up with no apparent source of moisture, and childish scribbles appeared in the condensation. The worst was the voices. At first, just whispers at the edge of hearing, but they grew louder, more distinct. A child's laughter, an old woman's wails, and underneath it all, a deep, guttural growling that made my blood run cold. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was terrified. In all my years of investigating, I'd never encountered anything like this. This wasn't just a standard haunting. There was a malevolence here that I could feel in my bones. As night fell, things escalated. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the mirror. The voices became a cacophony, screaming and wailing. Objects flew across the tiny room, toilet paper, towels, even Doña Carmen's dentures in a glass by the sink. I tried to remain calm, to document everything with scientific detachment. But when the shower curtain wrapped itself around me like a shroud, I lost it. I stumbled out of the bathroom, gasping for air, my equipment abandoned behind me. Doña Carmen was waiting in the hallway, her roomy eyes wide with fear. "You see now? You believe me?" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Doña Carmen, I'm so sorry, but I don't think this is safe for you. We need to get you out of here tonight. I'll call Father Miguel and—" My words were cut off by an unearthly shriek from the bathroom. The door slammed shut, then burst open again. A blast of frigid air knocked us both off our feet, and there in the doorway stood a figure. It was like a woman, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with limbs at impossible angles. Its face was a blur, constantly shifting and changing. But its eyes, God, those eyes. pitch black and filled with such hatred and hunger. Doña Carmen screamed and began to pray rapidly in Spanish. I fumbled for the crucifix in my pocket, my training abandoning me in the face of this horror. The thing in the doorway cocked its head, regarding us with those terrible eyes. Then it smiled, a gash of darkness splitting its face, and spoke in a voice like breaking glass. Elena says, "Hello, abuela." Doña Carmen wailed and collapsed. The entity lunged forward, moving with a speed that defied physics. I threw myself in front of the old woman, holding up the crucifix and shouting the words of exorcism that had been drilled into me. For a moment, nothing happened. The thing loomed over us, that hungry smile growing wider. I could feel its cold breath on my face, smell the stench of decay. This was it, I thought. This is how I die. And then, miraculously, it recoiled. The prayers seemed to hurt it somehow. It shrieked again, a sound of fury and frustration. The lights in the house exploded in a shower of sparks. In the sudden darkness, I felt rather than saw the entity retreat back into the bathroom. There was a final, deafening crash, then silence. I don't know how long we sat there in the dark, Doña Carmen sobbing quietly and me trying to remember how to breathe. When I finally worked up the courage to check the bathroom, I found it in shambles. But the oppressive presence was gone, the air warm and still once more. We never did figure out exactly what happened that night. The priests called it a demon, but I'm not so sure. Whatever it was, it hasn't returned. We moved Doña Carmen to a new home just to be safe. I still investigate paranormal cases, but nothing has ever come close to what I experienced in that tiny bathroom. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those eyes, that voice. And I wonder, what if it had been stronger than our prayers? What if next time the crucifix isn't enough? There are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows, and sometimes they reach out and touch our lives in ways we can never forget. I just pray I never encounter anything like that again. But in this line of work, you never know what's waiting behind the next door. I was always fascinated by urban exploration. There's something thrilling about venturing into abandoned places, uncovering forgotten stories etched into crumbling walls. Back when I was 19, my friends Nathan, Alexis, and I had this whole urban exploration project going. We'd spend our weekends scouting out old buildings around Monterey, documenting our finds on a blog. It was mostly harmless fun until that day at the old asylum on the outskirts of Dr. Gonzalez. I remember it was a scorching hot Saturday in July. We'd heard rumors about this massive abandoned psychiatric hospital from the 1940s, supposedly shut down after some kind of scandal. The place had been on our list for months, but we'd put it off because it was a bit of a drive. That day, though, Alexis was insistent we check it out. Looking back, I should have noticed how on edge he seemed, but I was too excited about exploring a new spot. The asylum loomed before us, a sprawling concrete monstrosity choked by overgrown vines. As we approached, I felt a chill despite the summer heat. The windows were like dead eyes staring down at us. Nathan hesitated at the rusty fence, but Alexis was already scaling it. "Come on, guys. We didn't drive all this way to chicken out now," he called back. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Our flashlight beams cut through the gloom, revealing peeling paint and abandoned medical equipment. I was snapping photos when Alexis wandered off down a dim corridor. "Hey, wait up!" I called, hurrying after him with Nathan close behind. We found Alexis in what looked like an old patient room, rifling through a metal filing cabinet. "Dude, "What are you doing?" Natan asked. "We're just here to look around, not mess with stuff." Alexis ignored him, frantically flipping through yellowed papers. "It has to be here somewhere," he muttered. "What are you looking for?" I asked, growing uneasy. This wasn't like him at all. He whirled around, eyes wild. "My grandmother was a patient here. There might be records, something to explain." A distant crash echoed through the building, cutting him off. We all froze. "What was that?" Natan whispered. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound confident. But then we heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. Panic gripped me. "We need to go now." I grabbed Alexis's arm, but he shook me off. "I can't leave yet. I have to find—" The footsteps were getting closer. Without waiting, Natan and I bolted for the exit. I glanced back to see Alexis hesitating before finally running after us. We didn't stop until we reached the car, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that about?" Natan demanded once we'd caught our breath. Alexis slumped against the car, avoiding our eyes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have dragged you guys into this." "Into what?" I pressed. "What's going on, Alexis?" He was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "My grandmother, she was a patient here in the 60s. He swallowed hard. "She killed herself not long after being released. My mom never talks about it, but lately I've been having these dreams, nightmares, about this place, about my grandmother. I thought if I could find her records, maybe I'd understand." We were stunned into silence. Alexis had never mentioned any of this before. "I'm so sorry," I said finally. "But man, you can't just go breaking into places and going through confidential files. That's seriously illegal, not to mention dangerous. Who knows who else might have been in there?" He nodded miserably. "I know. I wasn't thinking straight. Can we just go home and forget this happened?" We agreed, but things were tense and awkward on the drive back. None of us mentioned the asylum again, and our urban exploration project kind of fizzled out after that. I figured that was the end of it. But a few weeks later, Natan called me in a panic. "Dude, you're not going to believe this. You know that exorcism case that's been all over the news? The girl in Dr. Gonzalez?" I'd heard something about it. Apparently some 21-year-old had been exhibiting signs of possession, speaking in tongues, displaying superhuman strength. The kind of story that usually turns out to be a hoax or has some medical explanation. "Yeah, what about it?" "Well, my cousin's friend is a nurse at the hospital where they're treating her. And get this, during one of her episodes, or whatever, she started ranting about Alexis, by name, said something about how he and his friends sought answers where they shouldn't have, and unleashed something dark. Freaky, right?" I felt my blood run cold. That's got to be a coincidence. How would some random girl know about Alexis or what happened at the asylum? I don't know, man, but it gets weirder. A priest involved in the case has been asking around about Alexis, like specifically trying to track him down. My mind was reeling. "Have you talked to Alexis about this?" "That's just it. No one's seen him in days. His mom says he took off on some road trip, but she seemed pretty sketchy about the details." I tried to rationalize it. Alexis had been going through some stuff, dealing with family history. Maybe he just needed to get away for a bit. And this possession thing, it had to be some kind of bizarre coincidence. Maybe the girl had seen our urban exploration blog at some point. There had to be a logical explanation. But as the days turned to weeks with no word from Alexis, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The exorcism case dragged on, making headlines with increasingly disturbing details. And I kept thinking back to that day at the asylum, the oppressive atmosphere, the inexplicable footsteps, the wild look in Alexis's eyes as he searched through those old files. What had he really been looking for? And what had he found? It's been months now. Alexis is still missing. The girl in Dr. Gonzalez is still undergoing treatment with no improvement. And I can't sleep without dreaming of that abandoned asylum, of endless dark corridors and a malevolent presence always just out of sight. I tell myself it's all in my head, that there's a rational explanation for everything. But deep down, I'm terrified that our youthful curiosity unleashed something we never should have disturbed, and I can't shake the feeling that someday soon, whatever's out there is going to come looking for Nathan and me to finish what it started. I don't know what to do. I can't go to the police. What would I even say? I'm scared to talk to that priest, afraid of what I might learn. So I'm putting this out here, hoping someone might have answers, or at least to warn others. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and sometimes the quest for answers can lead you down a path you can never return from. If anyone out there knows anything about what happened to Alexis, or has experienced anything similar, please reach out. I need to know I'm not going crazy, and I need to know how to make this stop before it's too late. I was visiting my aunt in Mezcala, a small town near Lake Chapala in Mexico. She had asked me to house-sit for a week while she was away on business. I'd always loved visiting this quaint little town, with its colorful buildings and friendly locales. The church in the town square was particularly beautiful, and I often found myself drawn to it. On my second night there, I decided to take an evening stroll around the square. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. As I approached the church, I felt a strange pull towards it. The doors were open, inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by flickering candles, creating an eerie atmosphere. I sat in one of the wooden pews, enjoying the peaceful silence. Before I knew it, I had dozed off. That's when the dream began. At first, it was pleasant. I was walking through a sunny field of wildflowers, but then I saw a small boy standing at the edge of the field, his back turned to me. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. As I got closer, I realized something was off. His clothes looked old-fashioned, like something from a century ago. Suddenly the boy turned around. His face, it wasn't human. It was twisted and distorted, with black, empty eyes. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The boy thing lunged at me, grabbing my arm with an ice-cold hand. I felt a burning sensation where it touched me. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. It took me a moment to remember where I was, still in the church, but now it was completely dark. How long had I been asleep? I fumbled for my phone to check the time. It was past midnight. As I stood up, I felt a stinging pain in my arm. I turned on my phone's flashlight and nearly dropped it in shock. There, on my forearm, was a distinct handprint, small like a child's. It was red and raised, as if I'd been burned. I ran out of the church, not stopping until I reached my aunt's house. I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the couch, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was just a dream, right? But the handprint, it was real. I could still see it, still feel the pain. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and shadow. When morning finally came, I hoped the whole thing would seem less terrifying in the daylight. but the handprint was still there, now a deep purple bruise. I spent the day in a daze, unable to focus on anything. I kept replaying the dream in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd hurt myself somehow while sleeping in the church pew. But that didn't explain the distinct shape of a child's hand. As evening approached, I became more and more anxious. I didn't want to be alone in the house. I called my aunt, hoping she could offer some reassurance. When I told her what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Avigais," she finally said, her voice tight with worry. "I should have warned you. There's something about that church. I've had experiences there too. Nothing as intense as yours, but strange things." She went on to tell me about objects moving on their own in her house at night, always after she'd visited the church, about dreams of children with black eyes, about feeling watched whenever she walked past the building. "I thought it was just me," she said. "I didn't want to scare you. I'm so sorry, querida. I'm coming home early. Just stay in the house tonight, okay? Don't go near the church." I agreed, relieved that I wouldn't have to spend another night alone. But as the sun began to set, I felt that same pull I'd felt the night before. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to go to the church. I resisted, staying inside with all the lights on. But as the night wore on, the urge grew stronger. I found myself standing at the window, staring at the church in the distance. Was it just my imagination, or could I see a small figure standing in front of it? I shook my head, trying to clear it. This was crazy. I was letting my fear get the best of me. I decided to distract myself by cleaning the house. As I was dusting the living room, I noticed something odd. There was a small handprint on the window, the same size as the one on my arm. My blood ran cold. I hadn't been near that window all day. And the print, it was on the inside of the glass. I backed away, my heart racing. That's when I heard it. A soft giggle coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. The giggle came again, this time from the kitchen. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and held it like a weapon. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response, just silence. I edged towards the kitchen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. As I reached the doorway, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I whirled around, swinging the book. It connected with something solid, and I heard a cry of pain, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. Panic overtook me. I ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock. As I finally got it open, I felt something grab my ankle. I kicked out blindly and felt my foot connect with something. There was another cry, and the grip on my ankle loosened. I didn't look back. I ran out into the night, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that house. I found myself in the town square, gasping for breath. The church loomed before me, its doors wide open despite the late hour. And there, standing in the doorway, was the boy from my dream. He smiled at me, revealing a mouth full of sharp teeth. Then he beckoned, inviting me in. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I took a step forward, then another. It was like I was sleepwalking, unable to control my own movements. Just as I reached the church steps, I heard a shout. "Avigais, stop!" It was my aunt. She had just pulled up in her car, having driven through the night to get back. Her voice broke whatever spell I was under. I blinked, coming back to myself. When I looked at the church doorway again, the boy was gone. My aunt rushed to me, wrapping me in a tight hug. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now. Let's go home." As we walked back to her house, I glanced over my shoulder at the church. For a moment, I thought I saw multiple small faces peering out from the windows, but when I looked again, they were gone. We spent that night in a hotel in the next town over. In the morning, we returned to pack up our things. The house seemed normal in the daylight, no sign of the terrifying events of the night before, but neither of us wanted to stay a moment longer than necessary. As we were leaving, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the front step, was a small handprint. It looked like it had been burned into the stone. My aunt saw it too. Without a word, she ushered me into the car. As we drove away, I watched the church disappear in the rearview mirror. I don't think I'll ever go back to Mescala, but sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear that childish giggle. And sometimes, when I wake up, I could swear I see a small, shadowy figure standing in the corner of my room, watching me with those black, empty eyes. I don't know what happened in that church or in that town. I don't know if it was real or if I was losing my mind. But I do know one thing. The handprint on my arm never faded. It's still there, a constant reminder of that terrifying night. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can feel it burning, as if that ghostly hand is grabbing me all over again. The only sound was the hum of my old pickup's engine and the occasional static from the radio as we lost signal out in the sticks. Jeff and I were making idle small talk, mostly complaining about work and looking forward to getting home to our beds. It was close to midnight, and a light fog was starting to roll in, giving everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. As we approached the railroad crossing, I instinctively slowed down, even though the warning lights weren't flashing. Growing up in this area, you develop a healthy respect for train crossings. There had been some nasty accidents over the years. Sure enough, just as we got close, the lights started blinking and the gate arms began to lower. I brought the truck to a stop and we waited for the train to pass. But something felt off. The night seemed to get impossibly quiet and still. No rumbling of an approaching locomotive, no blaring horn, just total silence except for the rhythmic flashing of the crossing lights. "You see the train?" Jeff asked, leaning forward to peer down the tracks. I squinted into the darkness, but couldn't make anything out. "No, but it must be coming. Lights don't usually malfunction out here." We sat there for another minute, the silence growing more oppressive. I was about to suggest we just go around the gates when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Turning to look, I saw headlights approaching the crossing from the other direction. A chill ran down my spine. Something about the car's headlights looked wrong, old-fashioned somehow, and it was moving way too fast, showing no signs of slowing for the lowered gates. "That idiot's gonna crash right through," Jeff exclaimed. I fumbled for my phone, thinking to call 911, when suddenly I saw it, a massive dark shape hurtling down the tracks, moving impossibly fast and silent. No lights, no sound, just a great black void racing towards the crossing. "Oh my God," I whispered. The phantom train and the strange car were on a collision course. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I saw the car reach the tracks just as the train bore down on it. I tensed, waiting for the horrific impact. But it never came. In the blink of an eye, both the train and car simply vanished. 1 second they were there, about to collide, and the next, nothing. Just empty tracks and roads stretching off into the fog-shrouded night. Jeff and I sat there in stunned silence for several long moments. Finally, he spoke in a shaky voice. "What the hell just happened?" I shook my head, unable to form words. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Slowly the crossing gates raised and the warning lights stopped flashing as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Maybe we both dozed off for a second, Jeff suggested weakly, and dreamed it or something. But we both knew that wasn't the case. We had been wide awake, running on the adrenaline that comes from a near miss. What we saw was real, or at least as real as anything that defies explanation can be. I put the truck in gear and cautiously drove across the tracks. Neither of us spoke for several miles, lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Jeff broke the silence. "You remember that big train wreck that happened here years ago? My uncle was one of the first responders, said it was the worst thing he'd ever seen." I nodded grimly. Everyone in the area knew about that tragedy. It had happened about 15 years earlier. A packed passenger train collided with a car at that very same crossing we'd just passed. 18 people died, including a family of 4 in the car. It was the kind of event that scars a small community for generations. "You don't think—" Jeff trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "I don't know what to think," I replied honestly. We rode the rest of the way in silence. When I dropped Jeff off, he paused before getting out of the truck. "We saw something tonight," he said quietly. "Something that doesn't make any sense. But we both saw it." I nodded. "Yeah, we did. You gonna tell anyone?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "Who'd believe us? Hell, I'm not even sure I believe it myself." Jeff gave a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, guess you're right. See you at work tomorrow." As I drove the last few miles home, my mind raced. What exactly had we witnessed? Some kind of supernatural event? A glitch in reality? Or just an extremely vivid shared hallucination brought on by fatigue? I tried to rationalize it, to come up with some logical explanation. But deep down, I knew what we'd seen defied conventional understanding. It was as if, for just a few moments, we'd glimpsed a tear in the fabric of time and space. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the image of that phantom train and car, moments from impact, before vanishing into thin air. Had we somehow witnessed an echo of that tragic accident from years ago? A moment frozen in time, doomed to replay itself over and over. The questions haunted me. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself obsessively researching the old train accident, looking for any connections or clues. I even drove out to that crossing a few times, always at night, hoping to see something. But it was always just a normal railroad crossing, nothing out of the ordinary. Jeff and I never really talked about it again. It was like some unspoken agreement. We both knew what we saw, but discussing it somehow made it too real, too frightening to confront. Sometimes I'd catch his eye at work, and there would be this moment of shared understanding. But then we'd quickly look away and get back to our tasks. Months passed, then years. I never saw anything strange at that crossing again. But to this day, every time I drive over those tracks, I feel a chill run down my spine. My hands tighten on the wheel, and I find myself holding my breath until I'm safely on the other side. I don't know if what Jeff and I saw that night was some kind of paranormal event, a glimpse into another dimension, or just a trick of tired minds. But I do know this: it changed how I view reality. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, thin places where the veil between what we know and what we don't know can momentarily lift. And sometimes, in the dark of night, I still hear that phantom train whistle, a lonesome sound echoing across time and space, carrying with it the weight of tragedy and the mysteries of the universe. I was just getting out of the shower when I heard my husband John calling for me from downstairs. "Sonyo, where are you?" There was a strange edge to his voice that immediately put me on alert. "I'm up here just finishing my shower," I called back, wrapping a towel around myself. I heard his footsteps coming up the stairs quickly. When he appeared in the doorway of our bathroom, his face was pale. "But how is that possible? I just saw you downstairs." A chill ran down my spine, despite the steam still lingering in the air. "What do you mean? I've been in the shower for the last 20 minutes. John shook his head, looking utterly bewildered. "No, that can't be right. When I got home from work, you were in the kitchen. You even let me in. The keys were in the door." My stomach dropped. I had been home alone all afternoon and definitely hadn't let anyone in. I'd been looking forward to a long, hot shower to relax after a stressful day. "John, I swear I've been up here the whole time. I never went downstairs." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to make sense of things. "But I talked to you, Sonyo. You were wearing that blue dress you like, and you asked how my day was. We chatted for a few minutes about dinner plans." I felt dizzy suddenly and sat down hard on the edge of the tub. This was impossible. I'd been naked in the shower, not downstairs in a blue dress. That's not possible. I don't know what to say." John paced back and forth, agitated. "I know what I saw. It was you, clear as day. You even laughed at that dumb joke I always make about traffic. How could you not remember?" "Because it wasn't me," I snapped, fear making me lash out. "I'm telling you, I've been in here the whole time. Maybe you're confused or imagining things." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. John wasn't the type to hallucinate or make up stories. He looked just as freaked out as I felt. "Let's go downstairs," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe there's some explanation." I quickly threw on some clothes and we headed down to the kitchen. Everything looked normal, no sign that anyone else had been there. But then I noticed something on the counter that made my blood run cold. There was a half-empty glass of iced tea sitting there. "Did you pour yourself a drink when you came in?" I asked John, my voice shaking. He shook his head slowly. "No, you did. You were drinking it while we talked." I stared at the glass in horror. I hadn't made any iced tea that day. "This is insane," I whispered. "What the hell is going on?" We searched the whole house but found no sign of an intruder. All the doors and windows were locked. There was no logical explanation for what John had experienced. As the day went on, we tried to rationalize it away. Maybe John had dozed off for a minute when he got home and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I had sleepwalked or had some kind of fugue state. But deep down, we both knew those explanations didn't fit. What John had seen and interacted with seemed far too real and detailed to be a dream or hallucination. That night, neither of us slept well. I kept imagining a perfect copy of myself, wandering around the house, letting people in and carrying on conversations. The thought made my skin crawl. Over the next few days, we were both on edge, jumping at every little sound. I found myself constantly checking mirrors, half expecting to see my doppelganger staring back at me. John would give me strange looks sometimes, like he wasn't quite sure if I was really me. About a week after the incident, things got even weirder. I was in the backyard gardening when our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thibodeau, called over the fence. "Oh, Sonyo, I've been meaning to thank you for that delicious gumbo you brought over the other day. It was so thoughtful of you to check on me when I wasn't feeling well." I froze, trowel in hand. "I'm sorry. What gumbo?" Mrs. Thibodeau looked confused. "You know, the pot you brought over on Tuesday evening, You said you had made too much and thought I might enjoy some. It was wonderful, dear. My mouth went dry. I hadn't cooked any gumbo that week, let alone taken any to Mrs. Thibodeau. Oh, right, of course, I managed to stammer. I'm glad you enjoyed it. As soon as she went back inside, I ran into the house in a panic. John, it happened again. When I told him what Mrs. Thibodeau had said, the color drained from his face. Oh, God, it's real. There really is some kind of double of you out there. We spent hours discussing what to do. Should we go to the police, a doctor, a priest? But we knew how crazy it would sound. We had no proof, just our own experiences and the word of one elderly neighbor. In the end, we decided to set up security cameras around the house. If this thing that looked like me showed up again, we'd have evidence. For the next few weeks, we obsessively checked the footage every day. But there was never anything unusual, just normal comings and goings. I started to wonder if we had both just lost our minds somehow. Then, about a month after the first incident, it happened again. I was at work when I got a call from John. His voice was shaking. Sonyo, you need to come home right now. I just saw it again. I rushed home to find John sitting on the couch, white as a sheet. He wordlessly pointed to his phone. There was a video playing, footage from one of our security cameras. It showed our front door opening, and there I was, clear as day, walking into the house. Except I had been at work all day, 20 miles away. We watched in horror as my doppelganger moved through the house, eerily mirroring my mannerisms and movements. It went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, then settled on the couch with a book, all things I commonly did after work. After about 30 minutes, it simply stood up and walked out the front door. And then it was gone. What is that thing? I whispered, my voice shaking. John just shook his head, looking shell-shocked. I don't know, but we have proof now. It's real. We've been living with this terrifying reality for months now. The other me shows up randomly, sometimes when I'm home, sometimes when I'm away. It interacts with neighbors, does chores around the house, even has conversations with John. We've consulted doctors, paranormal experts, even voodoo practitioners. This is Louisiana, after all. No one has any answers. Some think it's a tulpa, a thought form come to life. Others suggest it's my astral body somehow separating from my physical form. A few have darkly hinted at demonic possession. All I know is that somewhere out there, there's another version of me walking around. It looks like me, talks like me, knows things only I should know. But it's not me, and I have no idea what it wants or why it's here. We're thinking of moving, hoping maybe this thing is tied to the house somehow. But deep down, I'm terrified it will follow us wherever we go. So now I live in constant fear, never knowing when my double might appear or what it might do. Every time the phone rings or someone knocks on the door, I brace myself for another story of something I did when I wasn't there. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. The stress is tearing me and John apart. I've started to doubt my own memories, my own sense of self. Am I the real Sonyo, or am I the copy? I'm posting this in hopes that someone out there has experienced something similar or might have some answers. Please, if you know anything about what might be happening to me, reach out. I'm desperate for any explanation, any solution to make this nightmare end. Until then, I'll be here in Louisiana, living in fear of the other me, the one that comes and goes like a ghost, leaving chaos in its wake, the one that wears my face and lives my life when I'm not looking, the one that, for all I know, might be the real Sonyo after all.